The front door of my house did not just open. It was shoved inward with a violent thud that rattled the picture frames in the hallway. I was sitting in my favorite armchair enjoying the quiet of a Tuesday morning with a hot cup of black coffee when the storm hit. My son Devin and his wife Chelsea marched straight into my living room without even a knock. Before I could ask what was wrong, Chelsea slammed a thick stack of papers onto my coffee table. The envelopes were torn open and the documents inside were covered in bold red ink. Final notice. Foreclosure warning. Immediate action required. I am Oscar Rollins, 69 years old, a retired independent auditor who spent his entire life calculating risks and balancing ledgers. I thought I had seen every kind of financial disaster, but nothing prepared me for the betrayal my own flesh and blood brought into my home that morning. Before I share the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned, not demanded by entitled family members. I looked at the chaotic pile of debt on my antique table and then looked up at my son. Devin could not even meet my eyes. He stood there shifting his weight, staring at the hardwood floor while his wife paced like a caged animal. My late wife and I always said family was supposed to have your back, but the look on Chelsea's face told me she was not here for family. She was here for a bailout. "Oscar, we are losing the house," Chelsea shrieked. Her voice was shrill, completely devoid of the polite, cultured tone she usually used at country club dinners. "The bank is threatening to foreclose on our estate. We are hundreds of thousands of dollars in the hole, and we need cash immediately." She pointed a manicured finger right at my chest. "You need to sell this place now." I sat there in silence, letting her words hang in the air. Sell my house. This house. The one my late wife Brenda and I bought over 40 years ago, when this neighborhood was just a quiet, ignored corner of the city. Today, this area is a gold mine. Gentrification has swept through our streets like a tidal wave. Trendy coffee shops and high-rise condos have replaced the old family stores, and the property value of my modest four-bedroom home has skyrocketed to numbers that make real estate developers salivate. I get calls every week offering me cash, but I have never entertained a single one. This house is not just an asset. It is a monument to my survival. For 4 decades, I worked as an auditor. I spent my life hunched over spreadsheets, untangling financial messes for corporations, working 60-hour weeks so that my family would never know what it meant to go hungry. I missed holidays. I missed quiet evenings. I ground my bones into dust to pay off this mortgage so Brenda and I could have a fortress of our own. Brenda always warned me about Devin. She loved our son deeply, but she knew he was malleable, easily swayed by the allure of a lifestyle he could not afford. She warned me never to hand over the keys to our financial security. And now here was his wife, a woman born into a wealthy family, demanding I liquidate my life's work to cover their reckless mistakes. Chelsea kept ranting, her face turning a blotchy red. "We have spoken to a realtor, Oscar. You can get a massive payout for this lot. You can give us the money to save our home and we will find you a nice small apartment somewhere cheaper. It is the only logical solution. You are an old man living alone in a house that is too big for you. It is time to step up for your family." I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or stand up to intimidate her. Panic is the weapon of the unprepared, and I was a man who spent his life analyzing deficits and liabilities. I slowly lifted my mug, taking a deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark, bitter liquid warmed my throat. I placed the mug back on the coaster with a soft, precise click. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. I bypassed Chelsea entirely and locked my gaze onto my son. Devin, who was 35 years old, a mid-level manager who wore expensive suits he clearly could not afford, suddenly looked like a terrified child called into the principal's office. "Devin," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion, "why do you not sell your own house instead?" The question hit the room like a physical blow. Devin flinched. All the color drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly gray. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He just stared at me, completely speechless, emasculated by the sheer logic of my question. He knew the truth. They lived in a sprawling suburban mansion with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool they barely used. It was a property bought entirely on ego and suffocating debt. If they were drowning in bills, the most basic financial principle dictated that they liquidate their most expensive liability. But no. They wanted to keep their luxury facade intact while dismantling my foundation to pay for it. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, never breaking eye contact with my son. "You come into the home I built, throw your unpaid credit card bills on my table, and demand I make myself homeless so you can keep a mansion you never deserved. Is that the kind of man I raised? Devon swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. Dad, please, he whispered, his voice cracking. It is complicated. Chelsea's family cannot know about this. We will lose everything. You do not understand. I understand perfectly, I replied, my tone turning to ice. You want me to set myself on fire to keep your pride warm? The answer is no. Chelsea gasped as if she had been physically struck. The polished upper-class daughter-in-law vanished, replaced by something ugly and vicious. You selfish, miserable old man, she spat, her eyes narrowing into cold, hateful slits. We are your family. We are drowning, and you are sitting there hoarding wealth you do not even need. Devon tried to grab her arm to pull her back, but she yanked it away aggressively. We are not leaving empty-handed, Oscar. You think you can just say no and go back to drinking your coffee? You are losing your mind. You are old, stubborn, and clearly incapable of making rational decisions for this family. She grabbed her designer purse, her chest heaving with rage. If you will not sell this house willingly, we will find another way. The law does not let senile old men hoard property while their dependents suffer. We will force you to sell. We will see you in court. She spun on her expensive heels and stormed toward the door. Devon lingered for a fraction of a second, giving me one last pathetic, desperate look before scurrying out after his wife like a frightened dog. As the front door slammed shut, echoing through the quiet house, I did not feel fear. I felt absolute clarity. The war had just begun, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. The echo of the slammed front door faded, leaving my house in absolute silence. I did not sit there wallowing in grief. I did not shed a single tear or bury my face in my hands. A 40-year career as an independent auditor had hardwired my brain to respond to crises with cold, calculating logic. When people show you who they really are, you do not cry. You verify the numbers. I took my coffee mug to the kitchen sink, rinsed it out with precise movements, and walked straight into my home office. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and opened my encrypted laptop. Chelsea's parting threat about forcing me to sell my house through the legal system was not just the angry rambling of a spoiled daughter-in-law. It was a declaration of war. And in any war, the first step is securing your supply lines. I logged into my master financial dashboard. I needed to see exactly how deep their desperation went and if my perimeter was secure. I pulled up my credit reports from all three major bureaus. I scrutinized my property deeds, checked my retirement portfolios, and reviewed my primary checking accounts. Everything under my sole name remained untouched and heavily fortified by the complex passwords and two-factor authentication protocols I had put in place years ago. But a seasoned auditor knows that thieves do not usually break through the front door. They slip in through the windows you leave unlocked out of misplaced trust. I navigated to the secondary accounts menu, searching for the one blind spot I had foolishly allowed to exist. As the loading icons spun on the screen, my mind drifted back to a sterile hospital room 3 years ago. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor still haunted my quiet moments. Brenda was fading from breast cancer, but her mind remained as sharp as a diamond until her final breath. She held my hand, her grip weak, but her gaze fiercely intense. "Oscar," she had whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "You have to protect Devon from himself. He is a good boy, but his spine is made of glass. He will bend to whoever applies the most pressure. Never let him control your future. Never hand him the keys to your survival. Chelsea will devour his pride, and then she will come for your peace." I promised her I would be careful, but a father's love often wears a blindfold. A year ago, Devon came to me on the verge of tears about a temporary cash flow problem. He needed a safety net to show his mortgage lender to secure a better refinancing rate. It was just a formality, he swore. Against my better judgment, and perhaps driven by the lingering grief of losing Brenda and wanting to support our only child, I agreed to open a joint emergency savings account. I funded it with exactly $50,000. It was strictly for catastrophic medical emergencies, and Devon knew the rules. Now looking at the banking portal on my screen, the truth slapped me harder than Chelsea's screaming ever could. The balance on that joint account was zero. I took off my glasses, wiped the lenses with my microfiber cloth, and put them back on, thinking it was a glitch in the bank's system. It was no glitch. I pulled up the transaction history and followed the digital blood trail. Over the last 6 months, the money had not been withdrawn in one lump sum. It was bled dry through a series of calculated stealthy wire transfers. 5,000 here, 10,000 there, 8,000 just last week. The destination routing numbers did not belong to a mortgage lender. The funds were funneled directly into an external checking account registered solely to Chelsea Rollins. They did not just come to my house today to demand I sell my property. They came here because they had already stolen every liquid cent they could easily get their hands on, and it still was not enough to satisfy their monstrous debt. My own son had been robbing me blind while smiling in my face at Sunday dinners. The cold anger in my chest crystallized into pure, unadulterated focus. There is a specific kind of rage that an auditor feels when they catch a thief in the act. It is not loud, it is methodical, it is ruthless. I picked up my smartphone and dialed the Priority Wealth Management hotline for my bank. After verifying my identity with my security PIN and answering 2 background verification questions, I was connected to a senior account manager named Marcus. "Marcus," I said, my voice dangerously calm and authoritative. "I need to immediately freeze the joint savings account ending in 4721. I also need you to permanently revoke all access privileges and viewing rights for the secondary account holder, Devin Rollins. Following that, initiate a full internal fraud investigation on all wire transfers made to external accounts over the past 6 months." Marcus typed rapidly on his end. The clicking of his keyboard was the only sound on the line for several tense seconds. "Sir, I can certainly freeze the account to prevent any further transactions," Marcus replied smoothly. "However, since the account balance is currently 0, the freeze is merely administrative at this point. As for the fraud investigation, I must inform you of the bank's policy. Because Devin Rollins is a legally listed joint account holder, any transfers he initiated using his own credentials are legally considered authorized transactions. We cannot classify them as fraud if he willingly moved the funds, even if he sent them to his wife." I closed my eyes, cursing my own foolishness. A joint account meant joint ownership. Legally, Devin had the right to drain it, even if morally it was pure calculated theft. I knew this law intimately from my career, but experiencing it from the victim's side was a bitter pill to swallow. "I understand the legal technicality regarding the joint funds, Marcus," I replied, keeping my frustration tightly leashed. "Just execute the administrative freeze and remove his name from my banking profile entirely. I want a complete, impenetrable firewall between his financial identity and mine. Check my primary, checking my brokerage accounts and my retirement funds. Make sure there are absolutely no cross-links, no overdraft protections tied to his name, and no authorized user statuses active on any of my credit lines." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The typing stopped entirely. When Marcus finally spoke again, his confident, professional tone had fractured. He sounded hesitant, cautious, almost apologetic. "Mr. Rollins," Marcus started, clearing his throat nervously, "I am looking at your primary master profile right now. I cannot make any administrative changes to your individual accounts today." I frowned, gripping the edge of my mahogany desk. "Why not? Those accounts are under my sole name and my sole social security number." Marcus took a deep, audible breath. "Sir, a legal hold was placed on your entire financial portfolio less than an hour ago. Our legal department received a formal notice from a family court attorney representing your son, Devin Rollins. They filed an emergency petition to freeze your assets. The legal document claims that you are exhibiting severe signs of dementia and cognitive decline. They are actively seeking a medical conservatorship to seize full control of your estate." I hung up the phone without another word to Marcus. There was no point arguing with a bank employee bound by legal red tape. My assets were frozen. My financial life, meticulously built over 40 years of grueling work, was effectively locked behind a digital iron gate. I sat in my silent home office, the weight of my son's betrayal settling over me, not as despair, but as a rigid, hyper-focused clarity. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my mahogany desk, analyzing my options, waiting for the inevitable formal strike. The confirmation arrived the very next afternoon. A sharp, aggressive knock echoed through the hallway. When I opened the front door, a bored-looking process server stood on my porch. He handed me a thick manila envelope, mumbled a standard legal greeting, and walked away before I could even reply. I carried the heavy package back to my desk, sliced it open with a letter opener, and spread the documents out under the glow of my desk lamp. It was a formal summons from the family court. Petition for appointment of probate conservator. Petitioner Devin Rollins. Proposed conservatee Oscar Rollins. I read the allegations with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a fraudulent ledger. They painted a picture of a frail, confused old man who was squandering his assets and posing a danger to his own well-being. They were asking a judge to strip me of my civil rights, my financial autonomy, and my basic human dignity. They wanted the legal authority to sign my name, sell my property, and institutionalize me if they deemed it necessary. The sheer audacity of the paperwork was staggering. I turned to the supporting evidence section knowing full well that a court would not entertain an emergency financial freeze without a medical professional backing the claim. I found Exhibit A, a capacity declaration signed by a physician named Dr. Eris Thorne. I stared at the signature, a bitter realization washing over me. I remembered exactly who Dr. Thorne was. 3 months ago, during a humid July afternoon, I had been pruning the oak trees in the backyard. I had skipped breakfast and pushed myself too hard in the heat. My blood sugar plummeted, and I fainted briefly near the patio. Devin happened to be visiting that day to ask for money. He drove me to a local urgent care clinic where Dr. Thorne was the attending physician. I was disoriented for perhaps 20 minutes due to the hypoglycemia, a completely normal physiological response for a man my age who forgot to eat. After receiving an intravenous glucose drip, I was perfectly fine, sharp, and ready to go home. But I remembered Chelsea showing up at the clinic shortly after. I remembered her pulling Dr. Thorne out into the hallway for a private conversation while I was resting in the observation room. Now reading the sworn medical declaration, I saw exactly how she had weaponized that brief moment of physical vulnerability. The report was a masterpiece of fabricated symptoms. Dr. Thorne claimed I exhibited severe memory lapses, chronic disorientation, and an inability to recognize my own surroundings. The document concluded that I suffered from advanced dementia and lacked the capacity to manage my own finances or resist undue influence. They had twisted a simple drop in blood sugar into a terminal cognitive sentence. Chelsea and Devin had found a doctor willing to stretch medical ethics, likely in exchange for a quiet cash payoff from the money they had just stolen from my joint account. They were using my own hard-earned money to buy my legal execution. As I was scrutinizing the fraudulent medical report, my smartphone vibrated on the desk. The caller ID displayed Devin's name. A younger, more impulsive man might have ignored the call or answered with screaming rage. But an auditor knows that when a fraudster feels confident, they always talk too much. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the phone to my ear, maintaining complete silence. "Dad," Devin said. His voice was dripping with a sickening, condescending sweetness, the kind of tone one might use to soothe a frightened toddler or a lost dog. "Did you get the delivery from the court?" I did not respond immediately, letting the silence stretch across the line to make him uncomfortable. "Yes, I received the papers," I finally said, my voice deliberately flat and hollow. Devin sighed, a heavily performed sound of exhaustion. "Listen, Dad, we did not want to do this. Chelsea and I are just so worried about you. You have not been yourself lately, canceling our access to the bank, acting paranoid about your money. It is getting dangerous. We have to step in and make the hard choices to protect you from yourself." The sheer arrogance of his lie was almost impressive. "If you want to protect me, Devin, why are you trying to strip me of my basic human rights?" "Look, we can make all of this go away," Devin replied, dropping the caring son act and shifting to a sharp transactional tone. "You worked hard your whole life. You built a pristine reputation in the financial sector. You were a senior auditor. People respected you. You do not want your former colleagues and neighbors reading public court transcripts about how your mind has rotted away. You do not want the humiliation of a public competency hearing where a judge declares you unfit to live on your own." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "So here is the deal. You sign the house over to Chelsea and me voluntarily. You let us manage the sale to cover our debts, and we will move you into a premium assisted living facility. We will make sure you are comfortable. Do that, and I will call my lawyer right now to withdraw the conservatorship petition. No court, no public scandal, no embarrassing medical records exposed. We handle this quietly as a family." He was blackmailing me with my own legacy. Devin believed my pride was my ultimate weakness, assuming I would rather surrender my wealth than face the social stigma of being labeled senile in an open courtroom. He thought he had me cornered, backed against a wall with no exits and no leverage. I reached out with my left hand and pressed the discreet record button on the digital dictaphone I kept on my desk for business calls. The red light blinked steadily, capturing every syllable of his extortion attempt. I regulated my breathing, lowering my voice to sound defeated, tired, and thoroughly broken. I channeled the persona of the frightened old man he desperately wanted me to be. "I do not want a public scandal, Devon," I whispered, injecting just enough tremor into my words to sell the performance. "I need time to think." Devon let out a short, triumphant breath. "Take the weekend, Dad. We will bring the transfer deeds over on Monday morning. Make the smart choice." He ended the call. I placed my phone face down on the desk. The performance was over. I stopped the recording and saved the audio file to a secure encrypted flash drive. Devon thought he had just won the war by backing me into a corner. He did not realize he had just handed me the very weapon I would use to absolutely destroy him. I did not wait for the weekend to pass. The moment the sun rose on Wednesday morning, I locked my doors, bypassed my usual routine, and drove straight into the heart of the city legal district. I needed a fortress, and I knew exactly who the architect would be. Thomas Mitchell was not just a family law attorney. He was a legal predator who understood the mechanics of warfare just as well as I understood financial ledgers. I walked into his corner office overlooking the skyline, placed the digital dictaphone on his mahogany desk, and hit play. Thomas listened to Devon attempting to extort me, his expression hardening into a mask of professional fury. When the recording finished, Thomas leaned back, steepling his fingers. He did not offer empty sympathy. He offered a strategy. The first thing we needed was absolute surveillance. If Chelsea and Devon were bold enough to forge medical documents and steal $50,000, they would not patiently wait for the court to grant them a conservatorship. They would strike preemptively. By noon, Thomas had dispatched a discreet, high-end private security team to my property. While I remained in his office drafting, our counteroffensive technicians were wiring my home. They worked with surgical precision, embedding high-definition microcameras into the smoke detectors behind the ventilation grills and inside the spine of a hollowed-out encyclopedia on my living room bookshelf. Every angle of my private sanctuary was now feeding a secure, encrypted live stream directly to an application on my smartphone. There is a reason I trusted Thomas Mitchell with my life and my legacy. Trust is a rare currency, and ours was forged in the fire of absolute desperation 15 years ago. Back then, Thomas was a brilliant but junior partner at a mid-sized corporate law firm. He was systematically being framed by his senior partners for a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. They had falsified expense reports and manipulated routing numbers to make Thomas look like the mastermind. The Bar Association was preparing to strip his license, and federal prosecutors were circling him like vultures. I was hired as the independent auditor to review the firm accounts. The senior partners expected me to rubber stamp their fabricated findings. Instead, I spent 3 sleepless weeks tearing their ledgers apart line by line. I traced the digital breadcrumbs, uncovered their offshore shell companies, and handed the federal prosecutors a bulletproof dossier that exonerated Thomas completely and sent the real culprits to federal prison. I saved him from bankruptcy, disgrace, and a lengthy prison sentence. Thomas never forgot that. He looked at me across his desk today, not just as a client, but as the man who had preserved his life. He was a fiercely loyal ally, and right now I needed a soldier who would not flinch. As Thomas and I were reviewing the legal statutes regarding irrevocable trusts, my smartphone vibrated aggressively against the polished wood of his desk. A bright red banner flashed across the screen. Motion detected at the front entryway. I tapped the notification, bringing up the live video feed. Thomas walked around his desk to stand behind my shoulder, his eyes locked on the high-definition footage. The front door of my house swung open. It was not a forced entry. A key turned perfectly in the lock. Chelsea stepped into my hallway, looking around with a casual, entitled arrogance. She must have secretly made a copy of my spare key months ago, keeping it hidden for a moment exactly like this. She was not alone. Trailing closely behind her was a slick, greasy-looking man wearing an ill-fitting suit and clutching a digital laser measuring tape. He had the unmistakable aura of a bottom-feeder real estate flipper, the kind of predator who scavenged for distressed properties and desperate sellers. Chelsea led him straight into my living room, waving her hand around my home as if I were already dead and buried. I watched through the camera hidden in the bookshelf as this stranger walked across my Persian rugs, pointing his laser tool at my walls, calculating square footage and estimating profit margins. Chelsea stood with her hands on her hips, directing him like a project manager on a demolition site. She pointed to the custom oak dining table Brenda and I had bought for our 10th anniversary. She gestured toward the antique grandfather clock and the leather armchairs. I turned the volume up on my phone, the audio coming through with chilling clarity. Tell your cleanup crew to trash everything in the guest rooms, Chelsea ordered the man casually. We will keep the mahogany desk and the dining set. We can auction those off for a few thousand. Everything else goes straight to the dumpster. Clear it out fast. The sheer, unapologetic violation of my privacy made my blood run cold. I was watching a live broadcast of my own erasure. She was walking through the halls where I had mourned my wife, pricing out the furniture I had bought with decades of hard labor, treating my entire existence like an estate sale she could not wait to liquidate. Thomas placed a steady hand on my shoulder, a silent gesture reminding me to stay grounded. Every word she spoke was being recorded, time-stamped, and uploaded to a secure cloud server. She was willingly handing us the nails for her own coffin. The real estate flipper scribbled some numbers on his clipboard and looked around the immaculate living room. "This is a prime location," he said, his voice dripping with greed. "The lot alone is worth double what you are asking. Are you absolutely certain the owner is ready to vacate? The paperwork needs to be airtight before my investors move a single dollar." Chelsea scoffed a sharp, ugly sound that echoed through the empty house. She walked right up to the fireplace mantel, stopping mere inches from the decorative clock where one of my hidden cameras was flawlessly concealed. She used the reflection of the glass covering the clock face to check her lipstick, completely unaware that she was staring directly into the lens of her own destruction. She smoothed down her hair, admired her reflection, and smirked. "Do not worry about the current owner," Chelsea said, her voice dripping with venomous confidence as she looked straight into the hidden camera. "The old man is about to go to a mental asylum. Get the selling papers ready. I want this place listed and gutted by the end of next week." I watched the live feed on my smartphone as Chelsea and her sleazy real estate flipper finally walked out my front door. Thomas sat across from me in his office, his face a mask of cold professionalism. We had them exactly where we wanted them. Their arrogance was blinding them to their own impending ruin. But a predator's overconfidence is always their greatest weakness. 2 days after that unauthorized home invasion, my phone rang. It was not Devon. It was Robert Chelsea's father. He was a man born into generational wealth, the patriarch of an elite, affluent white family who viewed everyone outside their tax bracket as a charity case or a nuisance. He invited me to a private dinner at their sprawling country club estate. He framed it as a casual family get-together to discuss my health and future. I knew exactly what it was. It was a gilded interrogation. It was a psychological pressure campaign designed to bully me into signing away my life. I accepted the invitation immediately, knowing that walking into the enemy camp was the best way to map out their defenses. When I arrived at their gated mansion that Friday evening, Devon and Chelsea were already there, sitting rigidly on expensive velvet sofas. Robert and his wife Diane greeted me with tight, practiced smiles that did not reach their cold eyes. We moved to the formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a massive mahogany table and a glittering crystal chandelier. The dinner was an exercise in calculated intimidation. Between courses of dry-aged steak and imported wine, Robert and Diane began their synchronized assault. They spoke to me using the slow, exaggerated tones people use when addressing a toddler or a dementia patient. Robert leaned over his plate, swirling his expensive wine, and suggested that living alone in my gentrifying neighborhood was simply too dangerous for a man of my advanced age. Diane chimed in, claiming she had found a premier luxury assisted living facility that would cater perfectly to my declining cognitive needs. They painted the nursing home not as a forced confinement, but as a lavish retreat I should be eternally grateful to accept. Diane smiled her frozen, aristocratic smile, adjusting a heavy diamond necklace that probably cost more than my first mortgage. "We only want what is best for you, Oscar. Chelsea and Devon have their whole lives ahead of them. They are building their future, expanding their impressive real estate portfolio, and preparing for children. It is simply unfair to burden them with the constant draining worry of your medical care." Robert chimed in smoothly, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Our family has always believed in managing our assets and our elders with dignity. We are prepared to personally subsidize the monthly costs of this medical facility. You would sell your outdated property, transfer the liquid assets into a trust managed by Devon, and live out your remaining years in absolute comfort. It is the logical progression of things. You have had a good run, Oscar, but being stubborn now will only damage your legacy." They spoke of my home, my sanctuary built on 4 decades of sweat and sacrifice, as if it were a dilapidated shack, holding back their daughter's manifest destiny. They boasted about their own sprawling real estate investments, their stock portfolios, and their exclusive country club memberships, subtly contrasting their immaculate success with my perceived financial frailty. Chelsea sat quietly across from me, sipping her wine, a smug, victorious glimmer in her eyes. She clearly believed her parents had cornered me. She thought their overwhelming wealth and aggressive condescension would force me into quiet submission. Devon kept his eyes glued to his plate, chewing his food mechanically, completely castrated by his wife's powerful family. I sat there in silence, letting them inflate their own egos. I chewed my steak, savoring the rich flavor, and allowed them to lay out their entire patronizing narrative. I realized then that Robert and Diane genuinely believed the lie. They thought I was a broke, confused, stubborn old man clinging to bricks and mortar out of senile sentimentality. They actually believed Devon and Chelsea were flourishing, successful young professionals unfairly burdened by a sick father. I finished my bite, wiped my mouth meticulously with the linen napkin, and placed my silverware parallel on the porcelain plate. The clinking sound echoed sharply in the large, quiet dining room. I looked directly at Robert, bypassing Devon and Chelsea entirely. Robert, Diane. I appreciate your remarkable generosity and your deep concern for my cognitive health, I said. My voice was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of the frailty they expected. You clearly value financial responsibility and generational success. You have raised your daughter to expect a certain standard of living. Robert puffed out his chest, slightly pleased with the apparent compliment. Exactly, Oscar. We simply want to ensure that standard is maintained while keeping you safe. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of the heavy mahogany table. I locked eyes with the patriarch. Then, before we finalize any paperwork regarding my relocation to an asylum, I have a very simple question for you both. As experts in wealth management, do you know that your successful son-in-law and your brilliant daughter are currently $500,000 in debt? The silence that slammed into the dining room was absolute, suffocating, and instantaneous. The smug, aristocratic masks on Robert and Diane's faces cracked, replaced by sheer, unadulterated confusion. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the clinical, merciless precision of a senior auditor presenting a catastrophic financial disparity. They are drowning in maxed-out credit lines, predatory loans, and imminent foreclosure notices. I continued my words, cutting through the air like a scalpel. They did not invite you to this dinner to secure my medical care. They brought you here to help them bully me into liquidating my home so they can secretly pay off a massive financial black hole before you inevitably discover that they are completely and utterly broke. Robert froze his wine glass, hovering halfway to his mouth. Diane stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, before snapping her head toward her daughter. Chelsea, what is he talking about? Diane demanded, her voice shrill and laced with sudden panic. Chelsea's face turned a horrifying shade of chalk white. Total panic erupted in her eyes. She stood up so violently that her knees slammed into the underside of the heavy table. Her hand struck her full glass of red wine, sending it crashing across the table. The dark red liquid exploded over the pristine white tablecloth, looking like fresh blood, shattering the crystal and dripping onto her mother's expensive dress. "Shut up," Chelsea screamed at me, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "He is lying. He is insane. Do not listen to him." Devon looked like he was going to vomit right there on the Persian rug. He buried his face in his hands, trembling uncontrollably. I sat back in my chair, completely untouched by the spilled wine and the exploding chaos. I looked at Chelsea's terrified, desperate face, and a profound realization clicked into place. Robert and Diane had absolutely no idea. Chelsea and Devon had been hiding this catastrophic debt from her wealthy family out of pure shame and fear of being cut off. My house sale was never just about paying a bank. It was a desperate cover-up to hide their failure from the very people sitting at this table. I did not stay for dessert. I stood up from the stained mahogany table, offered a polite, abbreviated nod to Robert and Diane, and walked out the front door of their sprawling mansion. They were too paralyzed by the sight of their hysterical daughter and the shattered crystal to even register my departure. The cool night air felt magnificent against my face as I walked to my car. I slipped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and immediately dialed Thomas Mitchell. He answered on the second ring. I told him exactly what had just transpired in that dining room. I described the absolute, unadulterated panic in Chelsea's eyes and the sheer terror radiating from my son. $500,000 in debt is a catastrophic sum, but young, arrogant couples file for bankruptcy every single day. Bankruptcy is embarrassing, but it does not cause a grown man to tremble like he is facing a firing squad. There was a much darker secret buried beneath that mountain of debt, and Robert and Diane were completely oblivious to it. I instructed Thomas to unleash his private investigator. I did not just want a surface-level background check. I wanted a full forensic financial autopsy. I wanted the investigator to dig deep into the underground cash flow of Devin and Chelsea Rollins. I needed to know exactly where that money went, who they owed it to, and why they were desperate enough to try and strip a healthy man of his civil rights to get it. 3 days later, Thomas summoned me to his downtown office. When I walked through his heavy oak doors, the private investigator was already sitting there. He was a quiet, unassuming man with the meticulous energy of a bloodhound. On the desk between them rested a thick black binder. It was not just a report, it was the blueprint of a massive criminal implosion. Thomas did not even offer me a cup of coffee. He simply pushed the binder across the desk and told me to look at the highlighted sections. What I found inside was a revelation so shocking it made my stomach drop, even with my 40 years of auditing experience. Chelsea Rollins was not just a spoiled rich girl with a shopping addiction. She was a degenerate, high-stakes gambler. The investigator had tracked her movements over the past 2 years to a series of underground illegal VIP casinos operating behind the facades of luxury private clubs in the city. She had developed a catastrophic addiction to high-stakes baccarat and offshore sports betting syndicates. The designer bags and luxury vacations were just a smokescreen to maintain her socialite image while she was hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars at the poker tables. But a gambling addict needs a continuous supply of capital, and Devin's mid-level management salary could not even cover the interest on her losses. So my spineless son did what weak men always do when pressured by a manipulative partner. He crossed the line from incompetence into outright criminality. Devin worked within the acquisitions department of Robert's massive real estate development firm. The investigator had managed to pull digital footprints showing a sophisticated yet ultimately traceable pattern of embezzlement. Devin had been cooking his own father-in-law's books. He had created a network of ghost vendors, dummy corporations registered under shell names, and systematically funneled corporate acquisition funds into these fake accounts. He was approving fraudulent invoices, signing off on fake consulting fees, and routing the stolen corporate cash directly into Chelsea's gambling accounts to keep the underground debt collectors away from their front door. My son was not just a bad financial planner. He was an active corporate embezzler, stealing from the very family that had given him his status. As I read through the financial forensics, the entire puzzle clicked into place with terrifying mathematical precision. Every confusing action they had taken over the last few months suddenly made perfect, malicious sense. I am an auditor. I know exactly how corporate fiscal calendars work. Robert's real estate firm was massive, which meant they were legally required to undergo an annual independent external audit. The investigator's notes confirmed that the firm's end-of-year corporate audit was scheduled to begin in exactly 1 month. When those external auditors arrived, they would perform routine vendor reconciliation. They would easily flag the dummy corporations Devin had created. They would follow the wire transfers, and the missing $500,000 would trigger an immediate federal investigation. This was never about paying off credit cards or keeping up appearances at the country club. This was a desperate ticking time bomb. If Devin could not replace the stolen corporate funds before the audit commenced next month, Robert would discover the embezzlement. Robert was a proud, ruthless businessman. He would not hesitate to hand his own son-in-law over to the federal authorities to protect his company's reputation. Devin was staring down the barrel of a 10 to 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. Chelsea would be disinherited, publicly disgraced, and potentially indicted as an accomplice to wire fraud. They were trapped in a corner of their own making. My house was the only asset they knew of that was completely unencumbered by debt. Situated in a prime, heavily gentrified neighborhood, my property could be liquidated to a cash buyer in a matter of days. It was the perfect massive cash injection they needed to silently refund the stolen corporate accounts before the auditors arrived. But I had refused to sell. So they pivoted to the conservatorship. By declaring me mentally incompetent and throwing me into a locked medical facility, Devin would be granted emergency legal authority over my estate. He could sign the deed auction my home to his sleazy real estate flipper and cover up his federal crimes using the equity I had spent my entire life building. They were literally planning to sacrifice my freedom, my sanity, and my home to buy their way out of a prison sentence. I closed the black binder. The heavy thud of the cardboard cover echoed in Thomas's quiet office. I rested my hands flat on top of the dossier. The leather of the binder felt cool and solid beneath my palms. For weeks I had felt the nagging, uncomfortable pressure of being the prey. I had felt the indignity of being hunted by my own flesh and blood, treated like an expiring asset waiting to be harvested. But sitting in that chair, holding the undeniable documented proof of their federal crimes, the dynamic shifted entirely. I was no longer the victim defending my territory. I was the executioner, holding the detonator. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the absolute icy satisfaction of a man who had just caught his enemies walking directly into a steel trap. They thought they were playing a game of emotional manipulation and family court technicalities against a confused old man. They did not realize they had just handed a veteran financial auditor the exact weapon needed to annihilate them. I looked up at Thomas, whose eyes were mirroring my own ruthless anticipation. We had the motive. We had the method. We had the evidence. The board was set, and the real game had finally begun. "Thomas, I want an irrevocable trust," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality in his corner office. "And I want the documents drafted and executed before the financial markets close this afternoon." Thomas did not ask for further explanation. He had just seen the undeniable proof of Devon and Chelsea's federal embezzlement and illegal gambling debts. He understood immediately that we were no longer just building a defensive wall. We were digging a massive trench and filling it with legal fire. An irrevocable trust is the financial equivalent of a nuclear bunker. Once an asset is transferred into it, the original owner legally relinquishes all ownership rights. The trust becomes its own sovereign entity governed by a designated trustee and entirely immune to personal lawsuits, creditors, or fraudulent conservatorship claims. I appointed Thomas as the primary trustee. If Devon somehow managed to bribe a corrupt medical board and win his fraudulent petition in family court, he would be granted legal control over Oscar Rollins the person. But Oscar Rollins the person would own absolutely nothing. I watched Thomas draft the paperwork with blazing speed, his fingers flying across his keyboard. We meticulously excised Devon's name from every will, every beneficiary designation, and every inheritance clause I had ever created. I severed the bloodline legally and financially. Devon and Chelsea were cut out entirely, their names replaced by a charitable educational foundation Brenda and I had once discussed supporting. The paperwork was incredibly dense, filled with complex legal jargon designed to repel the most aggressive corporate litigators. Reading through the airtight clauses gave me a profound, unshakable sense of invincibility. The real work began the moment Thomas finalized the trust documents. We spent the next 48 hours executing a massive coordinated liquidation and transfer of my entire financial existence. I did not leave a single digital breadcrumb for my son to follow. I routed my primary checking savings and emergency liquid balances directly into the newly established trust accounts. I contacted my brokerage firms and executed in-kind transfers of my mutual funds, bonds, and blue-chip stocks. Every liquid asset I had accumulated over 40 years of grueling auditing work vanished from my personal portfolio and materialized behind the impenetrable firewall of the trust. But the crown jewel of this entire operation was the house. My 4-bedroom sanctuary in the rapidly gentrifying neighborhood was the exact asset Devon and Chelsea were plotting to steal to cover their federal embezzlement tracks before Robert's corporate auditors arrived. I sat in a sleek glass conference room with Thomas and an independent notary public, a heavy fountain pen resting in my hand. With a few deliberate measured strokes, I signed a quitclaim deed. I legally transferred the title of my home from Oscar Rollins to the Brenda Rollins Memorial Trust. When the notary pressed her heavy metal seal into the paper, a profound wave of relief washed over my shoulders. By late Friday afternoon, my personal net worth was technically zero. I was a ghost in the financial system. If Devon looked at my social security number now, he would find an empty shell. He could hack my passwords, forge medical documents, or parade a dozen corrupt doctors into a courtroom. It simply would not matter anymore. You cannot bleed a stone, and you cannot steal a house from a man who no longer owns it. I had completely starved the parasite. The explosive consequence of my actions detonated exactly 3 days later. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The neighborhood was dead quiet, blanketed in a heavy, oppressive darkness. I was awake, sitting in my armchair in the unlit living room, monitoring the live security feeds on my smartphone. Suddenly, piercing headlights slashed across my front lawn. A car swerved violently into my driveway, the tires screeching harshly against the concrete. The driver's side door flew open before the engine even cut off. It was Devin's. He looked like a man being actively hunted by wolves. His designer tie was gone, his expensive dress shirt was wrinkled and soaked with dark patches of sweat, and his eyes were wild with sheer, unadulterated panic. He sprinted up the concrete walkway and began pounding his fists against my heavy oak front door. The sound echoed through the silent house like cannon fire. Dad opened the door. "Open the door right now," he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. He slammed his palms against the wood, completely abandoning any pretense of the caring, concerned son he had played for his lawyers. I watched him on the high-definition camera hidden in the porch light. He pulled a platinum credit card from his pocket, waving it frantically at the door as if it were a weapon. It was a backup emergency card I had issued to him 5 years ago, linked to an old home equity line I had completely forgotten about until Thomas and I rigorously scrubbed my accounts last week. Devin must have tried to use it tonight to pay off a desperate casino marker for Chelsea, or to satisfy an underground loan shark threatening his life. He had swiped the card, expecting a massive immediate cash advance, only to be met with a bright red decline notification. The final financial lifeline he thought he had kept secretly tucked away was dead. The panic radiating from his body was visceral. He kicked the base of the door, his breathing ragged and heavy. "Dad, the card is dead. The bank said the account does not exist. Turn it back on. I need the cash right now. I am begging you. Turn it back on." I walked slowly from the living room to the front door. I did not unlock the deadbolt. I simply slid the heavy brass security chain into place and cracked the door open just a few inches. The cool, damp night air rushed in, carrying the distinct scent of Devin's sour, panicked sweat. He lunged forward immediately, trying to push the door wider, but the forged steel chain held firm against his weight. He looked at me through the narrow gap, his chest heaving, his eyes bloodshot and desperate. "Give me the authorization code, Dad," he begged, his voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Please, you do not understand what they will do to me. We are out of time." I looked at the pathetic, cowardly man standing on my porch. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt nothing but absolute surgical detachment. I reached into the inside pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a crisp, folded legal document. It was a certified, watermarked copy of the trust transfer deed. I slid the thick paper through the crack in the door, letting it hit Devin directly in the chest. He fumbled to catch it, his shaking hands holding it up to the dim yellow light of the porch bulb. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, reading the irrevocable clauses and the absolute transfer of ownership. I stared into his terrified, widened eyes, delivering the final blow with chilling precision. "Read it carefully, Devin," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet night like a steel blade. "You are too late. I own nothing. And even if you manage to buy a judge and win your fraudulent conservatorship, you will never be able to touch a single brick of this house." I slammed the heavy oak door shut, driving the deadbolt home with a resounding metallic thud. Outside, Devin unleashed a guttural, animalistic scream of pure frustration. He kicked the porch railing, cursed into the night, and finally sped away, his tires leaving thick black marks on the asphalt. I returned to my armchair, feeling the adrenaline slowly recede, replaced by the cold, analytical calm of a man who knows the enemy's next move. When you corner a desperate animal, it stops trying to be clever and resorts to sheer brute force. Devin and Chelsea had lost their financial leverage. They had lost the element of surprise. The only weapon they had left was physical coercion. I knew exactly what Chelsea would do next. If they could not legally steal my assets through a slow court process, they would try to strip me of my physical freedom immediately. They needed me declared incapacitated right now to pause the impending corporate audit and buy themselves time. At exactly 2 p.m. the next day, my security app sent a flurry of red alerts to my phone. I watched the live feed from the front porch camera. They were not knocking this time. Chelsea had deployed the nuclear option. She had called emergency services and falsely reported that her elderly father-in-law was having a violent psychotic break. She told the dispatchers that I was heavily armed, deeply confused, and actively threatening to take my own life. In the state of California, a claim like that triggers an immediate mandatory psychiatric hold. It allows law enforcement to forcibly remove a person from their home and lock them inside a psychiatric ward for 72 hours of involuntary observation. It is a terrifying, traumatizing experience designed to break a person's spirit. That was her goal. She wanted me dragged out of my home in a straitjacket. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the quiet afternoon of my neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively against the large bay windows of my living room. I checked the camera feeds. 2 heavy-duty police cruisers and a massive white ambulance had swerved onto my front lawn, blocking the street entirely. 4 police officers jumped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. Paramedics pulled a heavy stretcher from the back of the ambulance. My neighbors' people I had known for over 30 years stepped out onto their porches and lawns, their faces painted with shock and morbid curiosity. And right in the center of this manufactured chaos was Chelsea. She was putting on a performance that belonged on a theater stage. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching her chest, sobbing uncontrollably into a crumpled tissue. She had deliberately dressed down, wearing a messy sweater and no makeup to sell the image of a frantic, exhausted caregiver pushed to the absolute brink. "Oh, thank God you are here," she wailed, rushing toward the lead police officer. She grabbed his sleeve, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated hysteria. "He is completely out of his mind. He locked himself inside. He says he has nothing left to live for. He is going to hurt himself. Please, you have to break down the door. You have to save him." Devin stood slightly behind her, looking pale and sick, playing the role of the devastated son who could not bear to watch his father deteriorate. Chelsea continued her loud, dramatic narrative, making sure every neighbor on the block heard her vicious lies. She cried about how hard they had tried to help me, how my mind had decayed so rapidly, and how terrified they were that I would end up dead if the state did not intervene immediately. The lead officer nodded sympathetically, gesturing for his team to approach my front porch. They unclipped their heavy flashlights and radios, preparing to breach the door by force if necessary. They were treating my home like an active hostage situation. Chelsea buried her face in Devin's chest, her shoulders shaking with fake sobs, secretly reveling in the public humiliation she was orchestrating. She thought she had completely destroyed my reputation in front of my community. She thought she had won. I did not give them the satisfaction of breaking down my door. Before the lead officer could even raise his fist to knock, I turned the brass knob and pulled the heavy oak door wide open. I stepped out onto the porch, standing tall and completely steady. I was not wearing pajamas or disheveled clothes. I was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray 3-piece suit, a crisp white shirt, and a burgundy silk tie. My shoes were polished to a mirror shine. I looked exactly like the senior financial auditor. I was projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. The police officers froze in their tracks, clearly confused by the stark contrast between Chelsea's frantic description of a deranged, suicidal old man and the sharply dressed, composed gentleman standing before them. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, my voice calm, resonant, and perfectly polite. "I understand my daughter-in-law has made a rather alarming phone call regarding my mental state." The lead officer took a cautious step forward, his hand dropping away from his utility belt. "Sir, we received a report that you are a danger to yourself. We need to assess the situation and ensure you are safe." I smiled a brief, polite smile of cooperation. "I appreciate your diligence, officer. However, you have been deliberately misled by 2 individuals who are currently under investigation for severe financial fraud. Before you escalate this situation any further, I highly recommend you review this document." I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope bearing the official crest of the State Medical Board. I handed it directly to the lead officer. He opened it carefully and began to read. It was a comprehensive preemptive psychiatric evaluation. Knowing that Devin and Chelsea would eventually resort to desperate measures, Thomas Mitchell and I had booked an extensive session with Dr. Gregory Vance, the most respected board-certified forensic psychiatrist in the city. Dr. Vance frequently consulted for the federal courts, and his medical authority was absolute. The document detailed a grueling 4-hour cognitive and psychological assessment conducted just 48 hours ago. It explicitly stated that Oscar Rollins possessed exceptional mental acuity, 0 signs of dementia, and absolutely no suicidal ideations. Furthermore, Dr. Vance had specifically noted in his official medical conclusion that I was actively taking rational, protective legal steps against abusive family members. The officer read the final paragraph, his eyes scanning the impeccable credentials. and the undeniable, legally binding medical seal. The lead officer slowly lowered the crisp medical document. The sympathetic, protective demeanor he had shown Chelsea just moments ago vanished instantly. His expression hardened into a glare of pure professional outrage. Filing a false police report and misusing emergency psychiatric services are severe criminal offenses. He turned around, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, and locked his eyes directly on Chelsea. Chelsea stopped her fake sobbing. The crumpled tissue slipped from her trembling fingers and fell onto the manicured grass. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at my immaculate suit, then at the thick medical dossier in the officer's hand, and finally up at my face. The horrible, crushing realization washed over her in real time. She was not dealing with a fragile old man she could easily bully into submission. She was dealing with a master strategist who had anticipated her every move, countered her every attack, and remained 3 steps ahead of her entire criminal plot. Devon shrank back, trying to hide behind his wife, his eyes darting frantically toward their parked car. I stood on my porch, adjusting my burgundy silk tie with a calm, deliberate motion. I did not need to say a single word. The silence of my victory was deafening. The failed psychiatric hold on my front porch was a humiliating defeat for Chelsea, but desperate people do not simply surrender. They double down. 2 weeks later, we found ourselves sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit conference room of the family courthouse for the mandatory pre-trial mediation. The air in the room was thick with tension and the bitter scent of cheap institutional coffee. Across the polished mahogany table sat Devon, refusing to make eye contact, and Chelsea, who was vibrating with a toxic nervous energy. Flanking them was their legal counsel, a high-priced, aggressive bulldog of a lawyer named Sterling. Sterling did not waste any time with pleasantries. He unclasped his heavy leather briefcase and aggressively slammed a thick stack of documents onto the center of the table. He intended to dominate the room through sheer intimidation. He laid out the fabricated medical records signed by their bribed doctor, painting a grim, entirely fictional picture of my cognitive decline. Then he presented the financial statements. With practiced theatricality, Sterling pointed to the $50,000 that had been drained from my joint account, miraculously spinning Devon's outright theft into evidence of my own reckless, dementia-driven spending. He argued that I was hemorrhaging cash, making erratic financial choices, and presenting an immediate danger to my own estate. He slid a printed spreadsheet across the table, highlighting credit card debts and missed payments that I knew for a fact belonged to Chelsea. Yet he framed them as liabilities I had incurred during a state of mental confusion. It was a masterful, nauseating display of legal fiction designed to corner me into a settlement. Sterling demanded that I voluntarily sign over the conservatorship today to avoid the public humiliation of a trial, promising a smooth transition into an assisted living facility if I cooperated. Any normal man accused of such blatant lies would have slammed his fists on the table, screamed in outrage, and demanded justice right then and there. But I am not a normal man, and Thomas Mitchell is not a normal attorney. We are hunters, and in that mediation room we were perfectly content to play the wounded prey. I slouched slightly in my chair, allowing my shoulders to drop, projecting the image of a tired, defeated elder who was crumbling under the weight of the legal assault. Thomas played his part flawlessly. Instead of immediately detonating our nuclear evidence, the pristine psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Vance, the forensic audit of Devon's corporate embezzlement, or the irrevocable trust documents, Thomas simply offered mild procedural pushback. He asked mundane questions about the dates on the medical forms and requested minor clarifications on the bank statements. He mounted a defense so weak and uninspired that it practically invited Sterling to attack harder. Thomas deliberately fumbled through a few files, pretending to be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of Sterling's fabricated evidence. I watched the transformation across the table. Devon visibly relaxed, his tense posture melting into a posture of profound relief. He actually believed we had nothing. He thought his father was truly beaten. Chelsea leaned back in her chair, a smug, victorious smile spreading across her face. They thought my silence was surrender. They thought Thomas's lackluster defense meant we were legally outgunned and preparing to capitulate. The mediator, an exhausted woman who had clearly seen too many families tear each other apart over money, sighed heavily. Since we offered no substantial counter-evidence to Sterling's aggressive claims, she formally noted that mediation had failed, and the case would proceed to a formal evidentiary hearing in front of a judge. By holding our cards close to our chest, we had given Devon and Chelsea exactly what they wanted: enough rope to hang themselves in a public courtroom. An auditor knows that you never interrupt a fraudster while they are building their own gallows. You simply nod, take notes, and wait for the audit day. As the mediation concluded, the lawyers lingered behind in the conference room to sign the procedural dismissal forms. I stepped out into the echoing marble-floored hallway of the courthouse, buttoning my suit jacket. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the elevators when I heard the sharp, rapid clicking of designer heels behind me. Chelsea marched up, completely abandoning the fragile, concerned daughter-in-law persona she had maintained in front of the mediator. Without her lawyer or the mediator present, the venom spilled out of her unfiltered. She stepped directly into my personal space, her eyes gleaming with a malicious, unrestrained arrogance. "You are completely out of your depth, Oscar," she sneered, her voice a harsh, mocking whisper echoing off the marble walls. "Your lawyer is an absolute joke. You have no defense, and you know it. We are going to walk into that courtroom next week and strip you of every single asset you possess." She crossed her arms, looking me up and down with utter disgust. "I hope you took a good look at your house this morning, because you will not be returning to it. I already have contractors lined up to rip out those hideous carpets and tear down that outdated kitchen your wife loved so much. We are going to gut the place, flip it to the highest bidder, and I am going to personally pick out the cheapest, most depressing room in a state-run nursing home for you to rot in. You played a stupid game, old man, and now you are going to lose everything." She was practically vibrating with triumph, entirely intoxicated by her own perceived brilliance. She truly believed that because I had remained silent in that room, I had been conquered. She thought she had outsmarted a man who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate criminals, far more intelligent than a gambling addict playing with stolen money. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not break eye contact. I looked at the flushed, arrogant face of the woman who was unknowingly standing on the trapdoor of her own destruction. I leaned in slightly, closing the distance between us, and spoke with a terrifying, ice-cold calmness. "Make sure you invite your parents to the official court hearing next week, Chelsea." I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second to ensure the weight of my words landed perfectly on her ears. "They will absolutely love the show." I did not wait for her response. I simply turned and walked toward the elevator, the rhythmic sound of my dress shoes echoing down the corridor. As the brass doors slid open, I glanced back one final time. Chelsea was standing frozen in the middle of the hallway. The smug, victorious smirk had vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden, flickering shadow of confusion and doubt. She tried to brush it off, shaking her head as she turned away, but the seed of terror had been planted. The countdown to her absolute ruin had officially begun. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open exactly 1 week later, and the chilling reality of my warning finally materialized. I walked down the center aisle with Thomas Mitchell by my side, our footsteps echoing against the polished marble floors. The courtroom was an imposing theater of justice, wood-paneled and severe, designed to intimidate those who had something to hide. I had nothing to hide. I took my seat at the defense table, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored navy suit, and cast a deliberate glance across the aisle. Devon and Chelsea were already seated at the plaintiff table, flanked by their aggressive bulldog of a lawyer, Sterling. Chelsea looked radiant, dressed in a conservative but obviously expensive designer dress, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. She actually took my bait. Sitting directly behind her in the front row of the gallery, serving as character witnesses for the plaintiff, were her parents, Robert and Diane. They had come to the courthouse expecting to witness a swift, sanitized legal victory. They sat with impeccable posture, their faces radiating a toxic mixture of aristocratic pity and undeniable superiority. They looked at me as if I were a tragic, broken animal that needed to be put down for the good of the herd. They had come to testify to their son-in-law's upstanding moral character and their daughter's selfless devotion to my medical care. I looked directly at Robert, offering him a brief, polite nod. He did not return the gesture, simply turning his head away with a look of mild disgust. Chelsea caught my eye and offered a tight, victorious smirk. She truly believed the theater she had orchestrated was foolproof. She had no idea that she had just invited her parents to the front row of her own spectacular execution. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense magistrate named Honorable Davis, struck his gavel and called the hearing to order. Sterling immediately seized the floor, launching into a theatrical, highly rehearsed opening statement. He paced in front of the judge's bench, weaving a tragic fictional narrative about my sudden and devastating cognitive decline. He brandished the fraudulent medical declaration signed by Dr. Thorne, waving it in the air like undeniable gospel. "Your Honor, we are here today to save a man from himself," Sterling proclaimed, his voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. Oscar Rollins was once a brilliant auditor, a man of numbers and logic. But age is a cruel thief. Today he is a danger to his own estate, hemorrhaging cash, experiencing severe paranoid delusions, and isolating himself from the very family trying to save his life. Devin, my own son, actually lowered his head and wiped a phantom tear from his eye. It was a nauseating display. Sterling went on and on, detailing how my refusal to sell my house was an irrational symptom of advanced dementia, and how a conservatorship was the only legal mechanism to ensure I received the round-the-clock psychiatric care I desperately needed. He finished his opening statement with a dramatic sigh, returning to his seat as Robert and Diane nodded in solemn agreement from the gallery. The judge turned to our table. "Mr. Mitchell, does the defense have an opening statement?" Thomas stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He radiated the lethal, absolute calm of an apex predator. "Your Honor, the petitioner's entire case is built on a foundation of perjury, medical fraud, and desperate financial extortion," Thomas stated cleanly. "My client does not suffer from dementia. We have submitted Exhibit A, a comprehensive 4-hour psychiatric evaluation conducted just 5 days ago by Dr. Gregory Vance, the chief forensic psychiatrist for the State Medical Board. Dr. Vance concluded that Mr. Rollins possesses exceptional cognitive acuity and 0 signs of mental decline." Sterling shot out of his chair, shouting an objection, but the judge waved him down, deeply intrigued by the heavy credentials of our medical expert. Thomas continued, his voice turning ice cold. "Furthermore, Your Honor, my client is not isolating himself from a loving family. He is actively defending his estate from 2 individuals who are attempting to use this court to facilitate a massive criminal theft." Sterling slammed his hand on the plaintiff's table. "Objection, Your Honor. This is baseless slander. Counsel is making outrageous accusations without a single shred of proof." Thomas did not even look at Sterling. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on the judge. "We have absolute proof, Your Honor. We request the court's permission to submit and play 2 digital exhibits captured legally within the confines of my client's private residence, which will immediately demonstrate the true motive behind this conservatorship petition." The judge, clearly sensing the gravity of the shift in the room, granted permission over Sterling's frantic, stuttering objections. Thomas connected a secure tablet to the large flat-screen monitor mounted on the courtroom wall. The screen flickered to life, displaying the high-definition, time-stamped security footage from my living room. Devin and Chelsea stared at the monitor, their initial confusion morphing into sudden, paralyzing terror as they recognized the interior of my home. The video played. Chelsea appeared on the screen, using her stolen spare key to lead the sleazy real estate flipper into my sanctuary. Her voice rang out through the courtroom speakers, crisp, loud, and undeniably cruel. "Tell your cleanup crew to trash everything in the guest rooms," the digital Chelsea ordered. "We will keep the mahogany desk and the dining set. Everything else goes straight to the dumpster." The video showed her walking right up to the camera, fixing her lipstick in the reflection of my clock. "Do not worry about the current owner," her voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "The old man is about to go to a mental asylum. Get the selling papers ready. I want this place listed and gutted by the end of next week." Sterling turned the color of ash. Devin looked like he had stopped breathing entirely. Thomas did not give them a single second to recover. He immediately switched the file and played the audio recording from my home office. Devin's voice filled the silent courtroom, his tone shifting from sweet manipulation to aggressive blackmail. "You sign the house over to Chelsea and me," voluntarily, Devin's recorded voice demanded. "Do that, and I will call my lawyer right now to withdraw the conservatorship petition. No court, no public scandal, no embarrassing medical records exposed." The audio captured the raw, undeniable sound of a son extorting his own father, using a fraudulent mental health petition as a loaded weapon to steal real estate. The crisp, undeniable audio faded out, leaving a suffocating, heavy silence in its wake. The narrative of the weeping, devoted son and the heartbroken, loving daughter-in-law had been completely incinerated in less than 3 minutes. I slowly turned my head to look at the gallery behind the plaintiff's table. Robert and Diane were practically glued to their wooden benches. The aristocratic superiority that had defined their posture just moments ago had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Diane's face was completely drained of color, her mouth slightly open in sheer, unadulterated horror as she stared at the back of her daughter's head. Robert looked as if he had just been physically struck. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He was a ruthless businessman who prided himself on control, and he had just realized that he had been dragged into a public courtroom to serve as a character witness for a malicious extortionist plot orchestrated by his own flesh and blood. Chelsea did not dare turn around to look at her parents. She sat frozen, her manicured hands trembling violently on the defense table. The smug, victorious smirk was gone forever. The trap had snapped entirely shut, and the teeth had bitten straight through to the bone. The silence in the courtroom was already suffocating, but Thomas Mitchell had no intention of letting them breathe. He tapped his tablet again, shifting the screen from the security footage to a complex, color-coded financial flowchart. Sterling jumped up, his face purple with rage, yelling that financial records were completely irrelevant to a medical competency hearing. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding Sterling sit down, stating firmly that motive is absolutely relevant when elder fraud is alleged. Thomas walked the court through the forensic autopsy of Devon and Chelsea's lives. He pointed to the massive withdrawals from my joint account, but that was merely the appetizer. The main course was a series of dummy corporations and fake vendor invoices directly linked to the acquisitions department of Robert's real estate development firm. The digital arrows on the screen traced hundreds of thousands of corporate dollars flowing out of Robert's company, funneling straight into offshore sports betting syndicates and high-stakes VIP casino accounts registered exclusively to Chelsea Rollins. The total sum of the embezzlement sat glowing in bright red at the bottom of the screen: $500,000. Thomas explained with surgical precision that Robert's firm was facing its mandatory end-of-year audit in less than a month. Devon was staring down a federal wire fraud indictment. My four-bedroom house sitting securely in a highly gentrified neighborhood was the only unencumbered asset they could quickly liquidate to replace the stolen corporate funds before the federal auditors arrived. The judge turned his heavy gaze toward me. He asked if I wished to make a sworn statement on the record. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked to the witness stand. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. I did not look at my lawyer. I did not look at the gallery. I looked directly into the eyes of the judge. I am 69 years old. I began, my voice carrying the steady, unyielding weight of a man who has spent 4 decades hunting corporate criminals. I retired as a senior independent financial auditor. I know the anatomy of a failing balance sheet, and I know the desperate, destructive lengths people will go to when the math no longer adds up. I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes onto my son. Devon flinched, shrinking into his expensive, unpaid suit. Chelsea was staring at her lap, her entire body shaking. They did not file this petition because I forgot a doctor's appointment or because I fainted from low blood sugar. I stated the words ringing clear across the silent room. They are not asking for a conservatorship because I am sick. They are asking for a conservatorship because they are thieves trying to avoid going to prison. I pointed a steady finger at the glowing financial chart still displayed on the monitor. They stole $50,000 from my emergency savings, and when that was not enough to cover her gambling debts, my son decided to rob his own father-in-law. They knew they were trapped. They knew the corporate auditors were coming next month. They needed a massive, untraceable cash injection to put the money back before the federal authorities were alerted. My home was their only escape route. But because I refused to sell the sanctuary I built with my late wife, they decided the easiest solution was to bribe a doctor, declare me mentally incompetent, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and auction off my life to the highest bidder. This entire hearing is not a medical intervention. It is a calculated, premeditated crime scene. The naked truth hung in the courtroom air, stripping away every last illusion of family loyalty or medical concern. The judge looked at the fabricated medical report on his desk, then up at the staggering evidence of embezzlement displayed on the monitor. His face hardened into an expression of absolute disgust. He turned his attention to Sterling, who was completely silent. The aggressive bulldog lawyer was already sliding his legal pads into his briefcase, realizing he had been used to facilitate a massive fraud and was now desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout of his own clients. Does the petitioner have any actual verifiable medical evidence to refute this defense? The judge demanded, his voice sharp like a whip. Sterling slowly stood up, refusing to look at Devon or Chelsea. "No, Your Honor. In light of these unexpected exhibits, the petitioner formally withdraws the request for conservatorship." The judge did not just accept the withdrawal. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with judicial fury. "You do not get to simply withdraw from a fraud of this magnitude, Counselor," the judge snapped. "This court does not take kindly to being weaponized for financial extortion. The emergency petition for conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice. My medical rights, my financial autonomy, and my physical freedom were officially preserved." The gavel had not yet fallen, but the judge was not finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am ordering the court clerk to immediately forward all digital recordings, financial forensic reports, and the allegedly falsified medical declaration by Dr. Thorne directly to the district attorney's office and the state medical board. If this evidence holds up, you two will be facing charges for perjury, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Devon let out a weak, pathetic sob, burying his face in his trembling hands. Chelsea stared straight ahead, completely catatonic, her breathing shallow and ragged. They had walked into this courthouse expecting to walk out with the keys to my entire estate. Instead, they were walking out straight into the crosshairs of a criminal indictment. But the impending legal consequences were no longer their most immediate problem. The sound of heavy, rapid breathing came from the front row of the gallery. I looked over and saw Robert standing up. His face was a terrifying shade of crimson. The realization that his own son-in-law had systematically embezzled $500,000 from his legacy and that his daughter had gambled it away in illegal casinos completely shattered his aristocratic composure. He did not care about the armed bailiffs. He did not care about the strict decorum of the court. Robert let out a deafening, furious roar that echoed off the high ceilings. He lunged forward, vaulting over the low wooden partition separating the gallery from the plaintiff's table. He grabbed Devon by the collar of his suit, violently yanking him out of his heavy oak chair. "You stole from me!" Robert screamed, his voice raw with pure, unrestrained rage. "You stole from my company. You are a dead man." The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Devon shrieked in terror, desperately trying to pry Robert's hands off his throat as he was slammed backward against the table. Chelsea screamed for her father to stop, but Diane grabbed her daughter's arm, pulling her back with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The judge slammed his wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block, the sharp cracking noise cutting through the shouting, demanding order as the armed bailiffs rushed the floor to rip the men apart. The armed bailiffs finally managed to pry Robert's hands from Devon's neck, shoving the two men apart with sheer physical force. The judge's gavel continued to crack like gunfire against the sounding block, ordering the courtroom cleared immediately to prevent a full-scale riot. Thomas and I calmly packed our documents into our briefcases, watching the chaotic, violent exodus. Out in the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse, the tension had not dissipated. It had merely found a wider, more dangerous arena. I stepped through the heavy double doors just in time to witness the absolute climax of Robert's aristocratic fury. He had broken free from his wife's grasp, his face still flushed a terrifying shade of purple. Devon, straightening his torn suit collar and gasping for air, foolishly tried to offer an explanation. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, stammering about misunderstandings and temporary cash flow issues that he promised to resolve. Robert did not want to hear a financial presentation from the man who had just gutted his legacy. With a sudden explosive pivot, Robert planted his feet and delivered a devastating bare-knuckled punch directly into Devon's face. The sound of bone crunching against bone echoed loudly down the corridor. Devon's head snapped back violently, and he crumpled to the hard marble floor, blood instantly pouring from his shattered nose. He groaned, clutching his face, looking up at his father-in-law with wide, terrified eyes. Robert stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "You are not just fired," Robert roared, his voice trembling with a rage that had completely consumed his tailored composure. "I am driving straight from this courthouse to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am handing them every ledger, every hard drive, and every fake vendor invoice you ever touched. You are going to rot in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your pathetic life." Devon spat blood onto the pristine floor, looking desperately toward his wife for a lifeline. He expected the woman he had committed federal crimes for to drop to her knees and defend him against her father. Instead, Chelsea took a deliberate step backward, physically distancing herself from the bleeding man on the ground. The survival instinct of a cornered narcissist is a terrifying thing to witness. She looked at her father, her eyes wide and pleading, and instantly threw her husband under the bus. It was all his idea. Chelsea cried out, her voice shrill and desperate as she pointed an accusing finger at Devon. I did not know he was stealing from the company. He told me the money was from his annual bonuses. I am a victim here, Dad. He lied to me to fund his own sick ambitions. Devon stared at her, the shock of her absolute betrayal momentarily overriding the physical pain of his broken nose. He scrambled to his feet, wiping the blood from his mouth, his own survival instincts finally kicking in. "You lying parasite," Devon screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "I stole that money to pay off the Russian bookies who were threatening to break your legs. You blew $500,000 on underground baccarat, and you have the nerve to call yourself a victim. You orchestrated this whole conservatorship scam. You told me to forge the doctor's signature." Their vicious screaming match intensified, echoing down the courthouse corridor. They tore into each other like starving wolves, exposing every illicit gambling debt, every forged signature, and every dirty secret they had kept hidden for years. What they failed to realize in their blind panic was that the double doors to the main lobby had opened. A swarm of local journalists and legal reporters initially tipped off about a high-profile elder fraud case involving a prominent real estate family had flooded the hallway. Camera flashes erupted like strobe lights. Digital recorders and microphones were thrust forward, capturing every venomous accusation. Chelsea screamed obscenities at Devon, slapping his chest, while Devon shouted back, detailing exactly which underground casino she frequented. They were publicly crucifying each other on the evening news. The pristine, upper-class image they had so desperately tried to maintain was currently bleeding out on the courthouse floor, broadcast live to anyone with a smartphone. I stood a few feet away, watching the spectacular destruction of my only son and his toxic wife. A younger version of myself, the father who had worked 60 hours a week to buy Devon his first bicycle, might have stepped forward to intervene. That man might have felt a shred of pity for the bleeding, humiliated wreck standing in the flashing lights of the press. But that man had died the moment Devon forged a psychiatric hold to lock me in an asylum. I am an auditor. I balance ledgers. And today the accounts were finally settled. I adjusted the cuffs of my navy suit, picked up my leather briefcase, and began to walk down the center of the hallway. The crowd of reporters naturally parted, sensing the cold, unyielding authority radiating from my posture. I did not rush. I walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who had just successfully executed a flawless corporate takeover. As I passed the epicenter of the chaos, Devon suddenly lunged toward me, breaking away from Chelsea's frantic slapping. He grabbed the sleeve of my jacket, his bloody hands leaving a dark, rusty stain on the fine wool. "Dad, please," Devon sobbed, his face a grotesque mask of blood, tears, and absolute terror. "You have the trust fund. You have the cash from the house. You have to help me. They are going to lock me in a federal cage. I am your son. Please tell them it is a misunderstanding. Give Robert the money. Save me." I stopped walking. I did not pull my arm away. I slowly turned my head and looked down at the pathetic, ruined creature begging for his life. My expression was completely devoid of anger, sadness, or mercy. It was the blank, terrifying stare of a judge delivering a lethal sentence. "I warned you, Devon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut through the chaotic noise of the journalists. "I told you that you were burning your own house down to keep your pride warm. Now you get to sit in the ashes." I smoothly detached his bloody hand from my sleeve, letting his arm drop lifelessly to his side. I did not look back at Chelsea, who was now screaming at the camera crews to stop filming. I did not look at Robert, who was furiously dialing his corporate attorneys. I simply continued walking down the marble corridor, leaving the wreckage of their lives entirely behind me. Thomas Mitchell walked silently beside me, his briefcase in hand, a look of profound respect etched on his face. We pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp, bright afternoon air. The sprawling city moved around us, completely indifferent to the financial massacre that had just occurred inside. A yellow taxi was idling by the curb. I shook Thomas's hand, a firm, silent acknowledgement of a battle flawlessly executed. I opened the rear door of the cab and slid onto the worn leather seat. The driver, an older man with graying hair, glanced at me through the rearview mirror. He took in my tailored suit, the slight trace of blood on my sleeve, and the absolute calm resting on my face. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, pulling the meter lever down. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes for the first time in what felt like months. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the last remaining ounces of tension drain from my shoulders. "Take me home," I said, my voice steady and light. The storm has passed. The storm of their own making, however, was just beginning to make landfall. The week following the courthouse spectacle was the most profoundly peaceful 7 days I had experienced in years. I spent my mornings tending to the small garden in my backyard and my afternoons reading in my armchair, entirely unbothered by ringing phones or sudden aggressive knocks at my door. But while I was enjoying the quiet sanctuary of my home, a financial guillotine was dropping on Devon and Chelsea. The wheels of justice, especially when greased by the fury of a betrayed billionaire like Robert, turn with terrifying speed. By Tuesday morning, the banking institutions had officially declared war. Federal investigators had flagged every single checking, savings, and investment account bearing my son or daughter-in-law's names. The freeze was absolute and merciless. Thomas Mitchell called me briefly to confirm that the asset seizure had been executed flawlessly. He painted a pathetic picture of Devon standing at a grocery store checkout lane, his hands shaking as his premium credit cards were declined one after another. He had frantically tried to log into his banking applications on his phone, only to find his access permanently revoked. Chelsea had apparently tried to withdraw cash from a secondary account she thought was hidden from her father, only to have the automated teller machine swallow her card and display a glaring fraud alert. They had absolutely no access to liquid cash. They could not buy groceries, put gas in their luxury vehicles, or pay the hefty retainer for the criminal defense attorneys they so desperately needed. The illusion of their wealthy, untouchable lifestyle evaporated overnight, leaving them completely paralyzed in a digital financial desert. The frozen accounts were merely the opening salvo. Robert was a man who built his real estate empire on unapologetic ruthlessness, and he applied that exact same corporate brutality to his own flesh and blood. On Thursday, his company's legal department filed a massive civil lawsuit against Devon for corporate embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, and gross fraud. The lawsuit demanded immediate restitution of the stolen $500,000 plus massive punitive damages. But Robert knew Devon did not have the cash, so he went after the only tangible asset they possessed. Their sprawling suburban mansion, the very house they had desperately tried to save by sacrificing mine, became the primary target of asset recovery. Because Devon had fraudulently used corporate funds to pay down portions of their massive mortgage, the federal authorities and the bank had the legal right to seize the property as the proceeds of a criminal enterprise. On Friday afternoon, a convoy of federal marshals and bank representatives arrived at their pristine gated neighborhood. There was no polite knocking or time for negotiation. The authorities gave them exactly 1 hour to gather their essential personal belongings. I did not need to be there to envision the scene. My private investigator, whom Thomas had kept on retainer to monitor the fallout, sent me a detailed step-by-step report. Chelsea had screamed at the federal agents clutching her designer handbags, demanding they call her father to stop the madness. The agents simply handed her the foreclosure notice and escorted her off the manicured lawn. Heavy steel padlocks were installed on the custom mahogany front doors. Bright neon yellow seizure notices were plastered across the large bay windows, broadcasting their total financial ruin to the entire affluent neighborhood. They were stripped of their sanctuary, locked out of their own home, and forced to stand on the sidewalk with nothing but a few hastily packed suitcases. The poetic justice was undeniable. The people who had confidently planned to throw me into a state-run psychiatric ward and gut my home were now officially homeless, watching their own estate being repossessed by the very institutions they had tried to defraud. The collapse accelerated into a complete freefall. Devon was formally terminated from Robert's real estate firm, his corporate access badges deactivated, and his professional reputation permanently incinerated. No company in the country would ever hire an auditor or financial manager who was actively under federal investigation for embezzling $500,000. Realizing the walls were closing in rapidly, Devon allegedly made a desperate attempt to flee. According to the investigators' final report, Devon had purchased a one-way ticket to a country without an extradition treaty using the last remaining cash he had hidden in his office desk. But Robert had anticipated the cowardice. The federal authorities had already placed Devon on a strict no-fly list and flagged his passport. When he arrived at the international terminal, customs agents pulled him out of the security line, confiscated his travel documents, and informed him that any further attempt to leave the state would result in immediate incarceration. He was trapped. Chelsea, completely abandoning her husband to his fate, tried to crawl back to the very family she had humiliated. She took a cab directly to her parents' country club estate, expecting her mother's maternal instinct to override her father's fury. She expected a warm bed, a hot meal, and a team of high-priced lawyers to shield her from the consequences of her gambling addiction. Instead, she was met by armed private security guards at the heavy iron gates. Robert and Diane refused to even let her step foot on the driveway. Diane, who just a week ago had sat in my dining room pretending to be the epitome of aristocratic grace, had officially disowned her daughter. Chelsea was informed by the head of security that she had been written out of the family trust entirely, and that any further attempts to contact her parents would result in a trespassing charge and a restraining order. The family that prided itself on perfect appearances had surgically excised her like a cancerous tumor. She had no money, no husband she could rely on, no home, and absolutely no family. The high-stakes gambler had finally played her last chip and lost everything. The weather that weekend seemed to perfectly mirror the absolute destruction of their lives. By Sunday evening, a massive, relentless storm rolled into the city. Thunder shook the windows of my house, and heavy, freezing rain lashed against the roof. I was sitting in my living room, the fireplace casting a warm, steady glow across the hardwood floors, sipping a glass of aged bourbon. The house felt incredibly secure, a true fortress against the elements and the chaos outside. I had just turned off my reading lamp and prepared to head upstairs to bed when a sudden jarring noise cut through the sound of the pouring rain. It was not the polite standard ring of the doorbell. It was the desperate, frantic pounding of heavy fists against my thick oak front door. The knocking was relentless, accompanied by the muffled, pathetic sound of someone shouting my name through the thick wood, begging for shelter from the freezing downpour. I set my glass down on the coaster, watching the amber liquid ripple slightly from the vibrations. I knew exactly who was standing out there in the dark. I did not rush to the door. I picked up my smartphone from the side table and opened the security application. The high-definition infrared camera on my front porch illuminated the darkness with a crisp, stark clarity. The storm was violently thrashing the trees, and the rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. Huddled together under the small overhang of my porch were Devin and Chelsea. The visual contrast between the arrogant predators who had invaded my living room weeks ago and the pathetic, shivering creatures on my screen was staggering. They were completely soaked to the bone. Devin's once immaculate tailored suit was plastered to his skin, dripping muddy water onto my welcome mat. Chelsea looked entirely unrecognizable. Her expensive blowout was plastered flat against her skull, and her face was streaked with dark, running mascara. But the most telling detail was the luggage resting at their feet. They did not have the matching set of designer leather trunks they used for their luxury vacations. They were clutching two cheap, battered fabric suitcases that looked like they had been dragged through the mud. One of the zippers was broken, exposing a tangled mess of damp clothes. These were the panicked, chaotic bags of people who had been given exactly 60 minutes by federal marshals to pack their entire miserable lives and vacate the premises. They had likely walked several miles in this torrential downpour after a cab driver refused to take them any further without upfront cash. Devin raised his fist and pounded on the door again, looking directly up at the camera lens. His face was contorted in sheer panic. I watched them shiver in the freezing rain for another full minute, letting the absolute reality of their ruin wash over them. Then I placed my smartphone back on the coaster, stood up from my armchair, and walked slowly toward the foyer. I unlocked the primary deadbolt with a loud metallic clack and pulled the heavy oak door inward. The howling wind instantly rushed into the hallway, bringing with it the freezing spray of the storm. Before I could even say a word, Devin collapsed. His knees hit the wet concrete of the porch with a heavy thud. He did not just cry, he wailed. It was the loud, ugly, unrestrained sobbing of a man who had finally hit the absolute bottom of the abyss. "Dad, please." Devin gasped, his voice cracking and barely audible over the roaring thunder. "We have absolutely nowhere else to go. The bank took everything from us. The feds locked the doors and the credit cards are dead." My friends blocked my number, and Robert threatened to have me arrested if I stepped foot near his property. "We just need a place to sleep, just for a few nights until we can figure something out." "I am begging you, Dad. I am so sorry for everything I did to you. Please do not leave us out here in the freezing rain." Chelsea stepped forward, pushing past her husband's kneeling form. The wealthy, arrogant socialite who had sneered at my home and threatened to lock me in an asylum was completely gone. She was trembling violently, wrapping her arms around her soaked torso in a desperate attempt to stay warm. "Oscar, please listen to us," Chelsea pleaded, her teeth audibly chattering as the freezing wind whipped her wet hair across her face. "I know what we did was unforgivable. I know I was horrible to you, but we are desperate and completely out of options. My parents threw me out into the street. I will do anything you ask. You do not have to lift a finger in this house ever again. I will clean your floors. I will cook every meal. I will do all your laundry and scrub the bathrooms. I will be your live-in servant. Just let us sleep in the basement. We will not be a bother, I swear to you. Just give us a roof over our heads. We have not eaten since yesterday morning. I stood tall in the doorway, perfectly dry, the warm ambient light of my hallway casting a long shadow over their shivering forms. I looked down at my son still kneeling in the puddles of rainwater, and at his wife offering to trade her remaining dignity for a basement floor. I felt a fleeting, microscopic flicker of paternal instinct, the deep-seated urge to shelter my child from a storm. But the cold, calculated logic of a seasoned auditor immediately extinguished that spark. If I let them in, I would be welcoming parasites back into the host organism. I remembered the fraudulent medical report they paid a corrupt doctor to sign. I remembered the police arriving at my door to drag me away in a psychiatric hold based on their vicious lies. I remembered the $500,000 embezzled to fund illegal baccarat tables. Compassion is a currency, and they had permanently bankrupted my reserves. I am not your savior, Devon, I said, my voice cutting through the howling wind with absolute chilling detachment. I am the man you actively tried to destroy. You did not come here tonight because you are genuinely sorry for the severe federal crimes you committed against your own family. You came here because the government locked your bank accounts, your rich father-in-law disowned you, and every other parasitic avenue of survival has been permanently severed. You are only apologizing because you got caught and because you are cold. I shifted my gaze to Chelsea, who flinched visibly under my harsh stare. You stood in my living room, demanded I liquidate my entire life's work, and bragged about throwing me into the cheapest, most depressing room in a state-run nursing home. I continued my tone as hard and unforgiving as a diamond. You wanted to gut this house and auction off my life to pay your illicit gambling debts. Now you stand on my porch offering to scrub my toilets. I do not want your hollow apologies, and I certainly do not want your servitude. My sanctuary will not be polluted by your presence. This is my house, not a refugee camp for criminals. Devon reached out with a trembling wet hand, trying to grab the fabric of my trousers. Dad, please, you cannot just shut the door on us. We will freeze out here in the dark. Where are we supposed to go? I looked down at him, my expression completely void of mercy or hesitation. I took a deliberate step back into the warmth of my foyer and looked them both dead in the eyes. I delivered the exact same words I had spoken to them on that Tuesday morning when they first invaded my home to demand my life savings. Why do you not go back to your mansion? I did not wait for the realization to wash over their faces. I did not stay to listen to Devon's renewed screams or Chelsea's desperate sobbing. I swung the heavy oak door shut, sealing them outside in the freezing storm. The sound was incredibly final. I systematically secured the locks. Click, click, click. I engaged all 3 deadbolts, reinforcing the impenetrable barrier between my peace and their self-inflicted ruin. I turned my back to the door, walked calmly into the living room, picked up my glass of aged bourbon, and sat back down in my armchair, listening to the soothing crackle of the fireplace. Exactly 1 month after that torrential storm, the final gavel fell on my son's freedom. The federal authorities do not operate on emotion. They operate on a strict bureaucratic timeline, and their audit of Robert's real estate firm was exhaustive. Thomas Mitchell called me on a brisk Tuesday morning with the official update. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had formally indicted Devon Rollins. They arrested him at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, dragging him out in handcuffs just as the sun came up. The charges were staggering: wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, forging official signatures, and grand larceny. Because of his documented attempt to flee the country through the international terminal a few weeks prior, the federal judge categorically denied him bail. My son was labeled a severe flight risk. He was remanded to a federal holding facility, trading his tailored suits for a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Thomas forwarded me the public indictment records. Reading through the sterile legal phrasing of Devon's crimes brought a chilling sense of closure. He was staring down a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The fast-talking, arrogant manager who had casually threatened to institutionalize his own father was now locked in an 8x10 concrete cell, entirely stripped of his autonomy. There would be no clever lawyer to save him, and certainly no billionaire father-in-law to post his bond. Robert had unleashed the full might of his corporate legal team to assist the prosecution, ensuring that Devon would be buried under a mountain of irrefutable evidence. Chelsea, realizing that the ship was resting at the bottom of the ocean, made one final desperate maneuver to salvage herself. She officially filed for divorce. Her filing was a pathetic attempt to sever her legal ties to Devon's criminal enterprise and shield herself from the financial fallout. She requested emergency spousal support and petitioned the court to force her parents to reinstate her trust fund. The judge dismissed her requests with extreme prejudice. You cannot extract alimony from a man sitting in a federal holding cell with frozen assets, and no court in the country can force a private citizen like Robert to hand his wealth over to a daughter who actively defrauded his company. Chelsea was completely cut off. The private investigator Thomas, kept on retainer, sent me one final dossier detailing her current living situation. The reality of her downfall was almost difficult to comprehend. The woman who had sneered at my antique furniture and casually planned to auction off my life was now entirely destitute. With no resume, no references, and her name permanently associated with a high-profile corporate embezzlement scandal, she was utterly unhireable in the corporate world. Chelsea was forced to take a minimum-wage job working the graveyard shift at a greasy 24-hour fast food diner right off the interstate. Her primary responsibility was not managing accounts or attending country club galas. It was scrubbing the public restrooms. The investigator included a single photograph. Chelsea was wearing a stained polyester uniform holding a mop bucket, her face gaunt and exhausted. Her glamorous lifestyle had been replaced by the smell of cheap frying oil and industrial bleach. She lived in a dingy pay-by-the-week motel a few miles from the highway, entirely alone, counting her tips just to afford her weekly rent. The high-stakes gambler had lost everything and was now paying off her massive karmic debt one dirty floor at a time. Sitting in my silent home office reading that final report, I placed the file down and took a deep breath. For a brief, agonizing moment, the cold armor of the auditor cracked and the fragile heart of a father bled through. I closed my eyes and pictured Devon as a 7-year-old boy running through the sprinklers in the backyard, his laughter echoing through the humid summer air. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bicycle, holding the seat to keep him steady. A heavy, suffocating wave of sorrow washed over me. I questioned my own rigidity. I wondered just for a fleeting second if I should have paid the stolen $50,000 to the corporate accounts. I wondered if I should have absorbed the blow to save my only child from a federal cage. The paternal instinct to protect is a deeply ingrained biological flaw, and it whispered that I had been too ruthless. But then my eyes opened and my gaze fell upon the mahogany table where they had thrown those red foreclosure notices. The auditor's logic, honed over 4 decades of analyzing human deception, surged back to the surface, immediately extinguishing the irrational guilt. Empathy is a lethal liability when dealing with predators. I remembered the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I remembered the police arriving at my door ready to drag me away in a straitjacket based on their vicious lies. I remembered Chelsea measuring my living room to sell my sanctuary. If I had shown even a fraction of the weakness I was feeling now, they would not have hesitated to destroy me. If I had paid their debts, they would have simply found another reason to bleed me dry. I would be the one locked in a sterile, state-run medical facility, right now heavily medicated and stripped of my basic human rights, while they sipped champagne in my gutted home. Brenda had been right all along. I did exactly what I had to do to survive. I stood up from my desk, leaving the investigator's file behind, and walked into my living room. The space was quiet and secure, but the walls still held the invisible stains of their invasion. I could still see Chelsea standing by the fireplace, adjusting her lipstick while plotting my demise. I could still hear Devon's desperate extortionist threats echoing off the plaster. I decided I did not want to live inside a museum of their betrayal. I pulled out my phone and dialed a highly rated local contracting company. I ordered a complete cosmetic overhaul of the entire ground floor. I wanted contractors in the house by Monday morning. I instructed them to strip the old wallpaper sand down the trim and repaint the entire living room in a warm, vibrant shade of ivory. I wanted the sterile, tense atmosphere permanently erased. When the smell of fresh, clean paint finally filled the air, it would overwrite the lingering memory of their arrogance. The house had protected me, and now it was time to give it a fresh start, entirely cleansed of the ghosts who had tried to steal it. 6 months slipped by with the quiet, comforting rhythm of a life thoroughly reclaimed. The fresh ivory paint in my living room had fully cured, and with it the lingering shadows of the winter storm and the suffocating presence of betrayal had permanently vanished from my sanctuary. I had settled into a peaceful routine completely untroubled by the frantic legal battles or the desperate financial scheming that had once threatened to consume me. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. I decided to take my vintage sedan for a long drive out towards the county line, simply enjoying the deep hum of the engine and the vibrant fiery colors of the changing leaves. I was miles away from my gentrified neighborhood, cruising through a forgotten stretch of the suburbs where modern industrial parks gave way to sparse, dusty commercial strips. The fuel gauge on my dashboard dipped below a quarter tank, prompting me to pull off the main highway. I steered my car into the cracked concrete lot of a rundown independent gas station. It was a desolate place, featuring flickering fluorescent canopy lights and a row of outdated, weather-beaten pumps. I parked my car, popped the gas cap, and stepped out into the cool breeze. The air smelled strongly of diesel fuel and damp asphalt. It was the kind of isolated, transient place where people only stopped because they had absolutely no other choice. I inserted my credit card into the reader and waited for the transaction to process, my mind comfortably blank and completely at ease. As the fuel pump clicked and began filling my tank, my attention drifted to a figure working diligently at the adjacent island. A gas station attendant was hunched over the massive hood of a mud-splattered pickup truck, vigorously scrubbing the windshield with a squeegee and a bucket of soapy water. The worker was dressed in a highly unflattering, poorly fitting uniform. The stiff royal blue polo shirt was heavily wrinkled and stained with dark streaks of grease, paired with baggy khaki trousers that dragged carelessly against the wet pavement. I watched the attendant stretch awkwardly to reach the center of the heavy glass, clearly unaccustomed to the grueling physical demands of manual labor. The driver of the truck, a burly man in a plaid shirt, barked an impatient order from the driver's seat, gesturing aggressively for the attendant to clean a missed spot near the rear-view mirror. The worker flinched visibly, nodded submissively, and quickly attacked the glass again with frantic, uncoordinated swipes. The attendant turned her head to dip the squeegee back into the bucket, and the harsh overhead fluorescent light caught her profile. My grip on the fuel nozzle tightened. It was Chelsea. The high society socialite who had once sneered at my antique furniture, flaunted her designer handbags, and threatened to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward was now scrubbing dead bugs off a stranger's windshield for minimum wage. Her expensive salon-styled hair was shoved carelessly under a faded baseball cap bearing the gas station's cheap corporate logo. Her fingernails, once perfectly manicured and painted, were chipped and grimy. The heavy designer makeup she used to wear like a suit of armor was completely gone, revealing a gaunt, exhausted face that had aged years beyond her actual age. The truck driver tossed a few loose coins onto the wet hood as a meager tip and drove off, leaving her standing in a suffocating cloud of exhaust fumes. Chelsea turned to wipe her sweating forehead with the back of her uniform sleeve. As she did, her exhausted eyes swept across the concrete lot and locked directly onto mine. The squeegee slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the ground with a loud, wet smack. All the remaining color instantly drained from her face. She looked as though she had just seen a ghost materialize in the broad daylight. She stood completely paralyzed, her mouth slightly open, the sheer paralyzing shock of recognizing her former father-in-law rooting her feet to the spot. A lesser man might have reveled in the cruelty of the moment. He might have walked over, pointed a finger, and laughed loudly at her spectacular downfall. He might have reminded her of the opulent suburban mansion she lost, the luxury vehicles repossessed by the banks, or the federal prison cell her ex-husband currently occupied because of her gambling debts. But I am a retired auditor, and gloating is a foolish waste of energy. I had already won the war. I had absolutely nothing left to prove to the broken, shivering woman standing beside a soapy bucket. I finished pumping my gas, returned the heavy nozzle to its holster, and securely twisted my gas cap shut. I needed a bottle of water for the long drive back, so I walked calmly toward the small convenience store attached to the station. I did not alter my path to avoid her, nor did I march over to aggressively confront her. I walked with the steady, measured, unapologetic stride of a man completely at peace with his universe. Chelsea shrank back as I approached the entrance, practically pressing her spine against the metal casing of the fuel pump. She lowered her head desperately, trying to hide her face under the brim of her cheap cap, silently praying I would somehow pretend not to know her. I stepped inside the dingy store, grabbed a cold bottle of mineral water from the humming refrigerator case, and walked to the cash register. I paid for my drink with a crisp $20 bill. The cashier handed me my change. I took a single $10 bill from the stack and walked back out through the sliding automatic glass doors. Chelsea was still standing exactly where I had left her, trembling slightly in the cool autumn breeze, gripping her dirty squeegee like a protective shield. I walked directly over to her pump. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing her body for the verbal abuse, the harsh mockery, or the bitter insults she knew she fully deserved. Instead, I simply reached out and tucked the crisp $10 bill firmly under the handle of the windshield wiper fluid bucket resting on the concrete. I looked directly at her tired, defeated face. I did not smile, and I did not glare. I offered her the calm, detached truth. "Honest labor helps you sleep at night, Chelsea," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and completely devoid of malice. I turned my back on her, walked straight to my vintage sedan, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the smooth, powerful rumble of the motor breaking the heavy, awkward silence of the gas station lot. Through my rearview mirror, I watched the final, desperate remnants of Chelsea's arrogant facade shatter completely. The profound weight of my simple, quiet statement broke her in a way that shouting never could. She did not yell or curse at my departing car. She simply collapsed inward. She covered her face with her grease-stained hands and burst into violent, uncontrollable sobs right there on the oil-slicked concrete. It was the devastating, agonizing weeping of a person experiencing absolute, unadulterated humiliation. She had once believed that wealth and manipulation elevated her above the rest of the world, treating hard-working people with pure, unmasked contempt. Now, confronted by the very man she had tried to destroy, she was forced to swallow the bitter, inescapable reality of her own insignificance. My money, my home, and my dignity were entirely intact, while she was weeping over a $10 tip from the father-in-law she had tried to lock in a psychiatric ward. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled out of the parking lot, merging back onto the open highway. I did not look in the rearview mirror again. She belonged entirely to the past, and my road ahead was completely clear. I drove back to the city, the rhythmic hum of my vintage sedan grounding my thoughts. As I turned onto my street, the reality of my neighborhood's transformation struck me with renewed clarity. The gentrification that had been creeping in for years had finally reached its absolute peak. The corner where the old family-owned grocery store used to stand was now a towering complex of luxury lofts with floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The vacant lot down the block had been transformed into an artisanal coffee roaster and a boutique fitness studio. Young, affluent professionals walked their purebred dogs past my front lawn, completely unaware of the history buried beneath the pavement. My 4-bedroom house, the fortress Brenda and I had purchased over 40 years ago when the city had practically abandoned this district, was now sitting squarely in the center of a real estate gold rush. The following week, out of pure financial curiosity, I invited an elite commercial appraiser to assess the property. I walked him through the updated ivory living room, the pristine kitchen, and the expansive backyard. When he handed me his final valuation report, the number printed at the bottom of the page was staggering. The property value had not just doubled, it had tripled. The sheer magnificent irony of the situation was not lost on me. The exact asset my son and his wife had desperately tried to steal to cover a $500,000 embezzlement was now worth enough to buy their sprawling suburban mansion 3 times over. They had thrown their entire lives away for a fraction of what I was currently holding. I sat at my mahogany desk that evening looking at the appraisal document. For 4 decades, this house had been my anchor. It was the place where I raised my son, where I loved my wife, and ultimately where I defended my own life against the people I trusted most. But looking at the empty guest rooms and the silent hallways, the logical mind of the auditor took over. I did not need a fortress anymore. The war was decisively won, the enemies were vanquished, and the walls had served their defensive purpose. It was time to stop guarding the past and start investing in the rest of my life. I made the decision immediately. I instructed my real estate broker to list the property. Because of the aggressive market demand, a bidding war erupted within 48 hours. Cash offers poured in from corporate developers desperate to secure the prime corner lot. I accepted the highest bid, a staggering sum that completely bypassed the traditional mortgage process. With the liquidity secured within my irrevocable trust, I turned my attention to a completely different horizon. I did not want another suburban house with a lawn to mow and empty rooms to maintain. I wanted unobstructed peace. I contacted a luxury broker on the coast and found exactly what I was looking for. It was a sprawling top-floor penthouse apartment overlooking the ocean. The space was a masterpiece of modern architecture featuring expansive glass walls, a wraparound balcony, and a panoramic view of the deep blue water. There were no stairs, no dense neighborhoods, and no uninvited guests. The building offered secure private elevator access and 24-hour concierge service. I purchased the penthouse outright, wiring the funds directly from the trust. Standing on the balcony of my new home, listening to the rhythmic, soothing crash of the waves against the shoreline, I felt a profound physical release. The heavy protective armor I had worn for the past year finally fell away. I was no longer a man preparing for an ambush. I was a man enjoying the ultimate reward of a life lived with absolute integrity. Even after purchasing the coastal penthouse in full, the financial windfall from the sale of my house left a massive multi-million-dollar surplus sitting in my trust accounts. An auditor despises idle capital. Money must have a purpose, a direction, and a designated yield. I poured a glass of bourbon, sat in my new oceanfront living room, and thought about Brenda. I thought about her unwavering moral compass, her fierce belief in education, and the stark reality that our own son had chosen the path of a thief instead of the path of a scholar. I could not change Devon's choices, but I possessed the power to change the trajectory of dozens of other young lives. I called Thomas Mitchell the very next morning. I instructed him to draft the founding charters for a massive educational endowment. We named it the Brenda Rollins Memorial Scholarship Fund. I seeded the foundation with the entire remaining surplus from the real estate sale. But I did not create a generic charity. I engineered it with laser-focused precision. The scholarship was exclusively designed for brilliant, underprivileged African-American students who were pursuing advanced degrees in forensic accounting, financial auditing, and corporate law. I remembered what it was like 50 years ago, a young black man trying to break into a predominantly white financial industry, fighting for every ounce of credibility and respect. I wanted to build an army of sharp, incorruptible minds. I wanted to fund the education of young men and women who would dedicate their careers to uncovering fraud, dismantling corporate theft, and bringing white-collar criminals to justice. Thomas executed the legal framework flawlessly. We partnered with 3 prestigious universities, establishing full-ride scholarships that covered tuition, housing, and professional certification exams. When the first cohort of 10 students was selected, I reviewed their application essays. Reading about their drive, their resilience, and their commitment to financial integrity brought tears to my eyes. My wealth was no longer a target for parasites. It had become a weapon for truth. Brenda's name would not be remembered through the failures of our son. It would be immortalized by the brilliant, unstoppable professionals who would carry her legacy forward. The official closing day for the sale of my old house arrived with a quiet, undeniable grace. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at the title company facing the corporate developers who had purchased my lot. The escrow agent placed the final stack of transfer documents in front of me, sliding a heavy silver pen across the polished table. I picked up the pen and looked down at the address printed on the legal deed. The address of my battles, my sorrows, and my ultimate victory. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation or nostalgic regret. I signed my name with firm, deliberate strokes, legally handing over the keys. I placed the pen down and smiled. It was a deep, resonating smile that reached my eyes. The house had done its job perfectly. It had sheltered me when I was building my life, and it had protected me when that life was under attack. Its mission was finally complete, and so was mine. I stepped out of the expansive glass-walled living room and onto the sprawling wraparound balcony of my new penthouse. The cool evening ocean breeze immediately washed over my face, carrying the crisp, salty tang of the sea. It was a profound, cleansing wind, completely replacing the stale, suffocating air of the courtrooms, the lawyer offices, and the tense, toxic environment that had consumed my life for the past agonizing year. I held a heavy crystal glass in my right hand, filled with 2 fingers of a premium 20-year-old bourbon I had purposely saved for a moment of absolute victory, exactly like this. The amber liquid caught the fading golden light of the late afternoon sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The warmth of the bourbon traveled down my chest, a perfect, comforting burn that mirrored the fierce, undeniable satisfaction radiating through my entire being. Below me, the massive ocean waves crashed in a relentless, soothing rhythm against the shoreline, a sound of natural permanence that made the petty, malicious schemes of greedy humans seem incredibly small. Above, the sky was transforming into a magnificent, sprawling canvas of deep, bruised purples, vibrant oranges, and bleeding streaks of crimson. It was the kind of spectacular sunset that forces a man to pause and reflect on the immense, chaotic journey of his own existence. I leaned against the sturdy glass railing, looking out over the vast, uninterrupted horizon. There were no neighboring houses peering into my windows to judge my routines. There were no uninvited cars pulling into my driveway to demand my resources. There was only the endless ocean and the profound, absolute silence of a life wholly reclaimed. I had spent 4 decades of my career meticulously auditing the financial lives of massive corporations, searching for hidden discrepancies, phantom debts, and ugly truths. But the most grueling, devastating audit I ever conducted was the one forced upon my own family. I had successfully balanced my personal ledger. The debts of betrayal had been paid in full, and the toxic assets had been permanently liquidated. As the sun dipped lower, sinking silently below the water's edge, my thoughts turned to the complex, often dangerous concept of family. Society relentlessly conditions us to believe that blood ties are sacred, unbreakable bonds that must be preserved and honored at any physical or emotional cost. We are taught from a young age that being a parent means offering a blank check of infinite forgiveness, limitless financial resources, and unconditional surrender to our offspring. But my survival required me to completely dismantle that dangerous, romanticized fallacy. Blood does not automatically grant someone a lifelong, unquestionable VIP pass to your bank accounts, your sanity, or your sanctuary. Biology is merely a starting point. It is an introduction. What happens after that biological introduction is entirely dependent on character integrity and mutual respect. Respect cannot be demanded simply because a specific name is printed on a birth certificate. It must be actively earned through consistent, honorable actions and basic human decency. Devin and Chelsea believed that their status as my son and daughter-in-law gave them a permanent immunity from consequence. They arrogantly assumed my paternal love was a fatal weakness they could comfortably exploit to fund their illegal gambling habits and cover up their corporate embezzlement. They expected me to simply lie down and accept my own destruction because a father is supposed to sacrifice everything for his child. But true love, the kind of structured, responsible love Brenda and I tried to instill in our son, absolutely requires accountability. When a family member looks you in the eye, lies to your face, and plots your demise, they are no longer your family. They are a predator wearing a familiar, comforting mask. The exact moment Devin forged a psychiatric document to lock me in an asylum, he ceased to be the boy I raised. He became a hostile entity, a calculated threat to my very existence. I realized that clinging to the ghost of the son I wished he was would only guarantee my own execution. To survive, I had to stop acting like a heartbroken father and start acting like a seasoned auditor. I had to evaluate the relationship based purely on the raw, undeniable data of their actions. The data proved they were completely bankrupt of morality, and so I closed their accounts permanently. If you are listening to my story right now, especially if you are in the later chapters of your own life, I want you to hear my words with absolute crystalline clarity. Do not ever allow the fear of loneliness to bully you into financing your own abuse. There are thousands of older men and women sitting in silent, miserable homes right now, quietly transferring their hard-earned savings, their pension checks, and the equity of their houses to ungrateful, entitled children. They silently endure the disrespect, the condescending eye rolls, the emotional manipulation, and the blatant financial theft, because they are terrified that if they cut off the money, their children will stop visiting them. They sacrifice their ultimate dignity just to buy a few pathetic hours of fake transactional affection. Let me tell you the harsh, undeniable truth that you must accept. If you have to pay your family to love you, they do not love you. They love your wallet. And the exact moment that wallet runs dry, they will discard you with a breathtaking, ruthless cruelty. You spent decades working, bleeding, and sacrificing to build your foundation. You earned the right to live your final years in absolute peace, surrounded by people who genuinely value your wisdom, not just your tangible assets. Do not let parental guilt be the weapon your family uses to strip you bare. You owe absolutely no one a comfortable, luxurious life if they are unwilling to work for it themselves. If your adult children are drowning in massive debts of their own reckless making, let them learn how to swim in the deep water. Rescuing them from the natural consequences of their actions only breeds a deeper, more resentful entitlement. Reclaim your power, lock your doors, secure your bank accounts, and demand the respect you inherently deserve. True lasting peace is not found in constantly appeasing toxic relatives. It is found in having the immense courage to walk away from anyone who views your kindness as a weakness to be exploited. I took the final slow sip of my bourbon, feeling the smooth, rich warmth settle deep in my chest as the last glowing sliver of the sun vanished beneath the dark ocean waves. The coastal sky turned a deep, quiet twilight, and the first bright stars began to pierce through the expanding darkness. My name is Oscar Rollins. I am 69 years old, a retired financial auditor, and a man who successfully defended his life against the very people who should have protected it. I lost a son, but I unequivocally saved my own soul. And if there is one piece of unshakable hard-earned wisdom I can leave you with tonight, it is this. Do not ever set your own house on fire just to keep people warm who are intentionally trying to freeze you to death. If my journey resonated with you, or if you have ever had to draw a hard, unforgiving line against toxic family members, let me know your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Please hit the like button, share this video with anyone who desperately needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, boundaries, and unapologetic truth. Stay strong, protect your peace, and never apologize for surviving. As I continue to watch the tide roll in and out beneath my balcony, the rhythmic crashing of the waves brings to mind a second, equally vital revelation. Beyond the painful understanding that blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, there is a much deeper, more insidious trap that parents of adult children frequently fall into. It is a trap built entirely of good intentions, societal conditioning, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what it actually means to save someone. I am talking about the catastrophic illusion of the financial bailout. For decades, I made my living as an independent auditor. My entire professional existence was dedicated to examining the structural integrity of failing institutions. When a corporation was hemorrhaging capital, drowning in toxic debt, and facing imminent collapse, the executives would invariably plead for an emergency cash injection. They would swear that just one more loan, just one massive influx of liquidity would right the ship and solve all their problems. But numbers do not have emotions, and ledgers do not lie. Injecting capital into a system plagued by gross mismanagement, ethical rot, and unchecked greed never saves the institution. It merely subsidizes the corruption, prolongs the inevitable collapse, and ultimately destroys the investor who was foolish enough to write the check. This exact same principle applies flawlessly to toxic family dynamics. Yet as parents, we are stubbornly blind to it. We are conditioned to believe that our primary biological function is to act as an eternal safety net for our offspring. When our adult children make reckless, destructive decisions, when they accumulate mountains of debt to finance a lifestyle they have not earned, our immediate visceral instinct is to shield them from the consequences. We dip into our retirement accounts. We remortgage the homes we spent 30 years paying off, and we casually sign away our own financial security under the devastatingly false premise that we are helping them. But we are not helping them. We are enabling their absolute worst impulses. We are teaching them that their actions have no real gravity because someone else will always step in to absorb the impact. Consider what would have happened if I had succumbed to Devin and Chelsea's demands on that fateful Tuesday morning. Suppose I had allowed the panic in my son's eyes to override my decades of financial training. Suppose I had immediately listed my house, handed them the cash, and quietly moved myself into some cramped, depressing apartment on the outskirts of the city. Would that have saved my son? Absolutely not. The money would have been funneled straight back into the corporate accounts Devin embezzled from temporarily silencing the federal auditors. They would have breathed a massive sigh of relief, patted themselves on the back for their clever manipulation, and then immediately returned to their disastrous habits. Chelsea would have walked right back into those underground VIP casinos, her gambling addiction completely unchecked and newly validated by the knowledge that my life savings could always be harvested to cover her losses. Devin would have continued living in his sprawling, unearned mansion, entirely insulated from the crushing reality of his own incompetence. By sacrificing my home, I would not have cured their disease. I would have simply become the latest casualty of it. I would have become their permanent hostage, a disposable asset they could continually mine whenever their own malicious choices caught up with them. Predatory family members are uniquely dangerous because they possess an intimate, encyclopedic knowledge of your psychological vulnerabilities. They know exactly which buttons to press to bypass your logic and directly access your guilt. They will weaponize your memories against you, bringing up childhood anecdotes or leveraging the legacy of a deceased spouse to make you feel as though denying their demands is a betrayal of the family unit itself. Chelsea and Devon tried to use my pristine professional reputation as a bargaining chip, assuming my fear of a public scandal would force me into quiet submission. They calculated that I would gladly trade my wealth for my dignity. They failed to realize that true dignity cannot be extorted. It is forged by standing firm in the blinding light of the truth, regardless of how ugly that truth makes the family portrait look to the outside world. When you finally stop trying to protect the public image of a broken family, you strip the abusers of their most potent weapon. The threat of exposure only works if you are afraid of the dark. Once you embrace the harsh, illuminating light of accountability, their threats evaporate into meaningless noise. There is an agonizing, terrifying, emotional threshold you must cross when you finally decide to stop bailing out an adult child. It feels fundamentally unnatural. It goes against every instinct you developed from the moment you first held them in your arms. Society will label you as cold, unforgiving, or selfish. Your own mind will torture you in the quiet hours of the night, whispering that a good father would never let his son face a federal indictment or sleep on the streets. But you must silence that voice with the cold, hard logic of accountability. A safety net is only useful for an acrobat who accidentally slips while attempting a disciplined, rigorous routine. When you place a safety net beneath individuals who are intentionally jumping off cliffs just for the thrill of the fall, you are no longer protecting them. You are actively encouraging them to jump from higher, more lethal altitudes without a harness. Sometimes the most profound transformative act of love you can offer a destructive adult is the unforgiving concrete of absolute failure. Hitting rock bottom is the only catalyst powerful enough to shatter the delusion of invincibility. It is the only force capable of stripping away the arrogant entitlement that allows a son to look his father in the eye and demand his home. By locking my door that night in the freezing rain, I did not abandon Devon. I handed him over to the supreme impartial authority of consequence. I allowed him to experience the full, unfiltered weight of his own criminal decisions. If he ever hopes to rebuild his life, if he ever hopes to find redemption after his time in a federal penitentiary, it will have to be built on a foundation of his own grueling effort, not on the stolen equity of my sacrifices. We must completely redefine what it means to support our grown children. True support is not financial servitude. It is allowing them the dignity to navigate the wreckage they create. It is recognizing that your season of active parenting has definitively ended, and your season of preserving your own peace has begun. Your retirement, your home, and your savings are the physical manifestations of your life's labor. They are not a communal slush fund for entitled relatives who view your aging as a convenient financial opportunity. Protect your assets with the ferocity of a soldier defending a fortress. Protect your mental health by severing ties with anyone who consistently brings chaos to your doorstep. You have earned the right to watch the sun set over a quiet ocean without carrying the crippling weight of someone else's manufactured disasters. Stand your ground. Refuse the role of the perpetual martyr and let the chips fall exactly where they have been recklessly tossed. Please remember to like this video, share it with anyone who needs the strength to set unbreakable boundaries, and subscribe to the channel for more unyielding truths.